Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us today to discuss the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Draft Final Proposal. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Today's meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. And while we welcome comments and questions, just a reminder to keep those comments professional and respectful. And in addition, we do have kind of limited time today. We are going until noon and have quite a bit of material to cover. So just a reminder to please try and be brief with your questions and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently. We will try to address as many comments and questions as we can. But if we do need to move on, we'll need to address those questions either offline or in the chat. So when it is time to ask a question or make a comment, you'll want to select the raise hand icon, which is located just to the right above the chat window. If you connected to audio outside of the WebEx, you'll need to press #2 to enter the question queue. And just a reminder to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question so that everyone else on the line knows who is speaking. And if you need technical assistance at any time during today's meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Sharon. And then you can also send your question in the chat to either myself, again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. So the agenda for today, in just a moment, I'll hand it over to Milosh to go over the initiative background and overview, and then we'll really jump into the content of the draft final proposal, and that discussion will be led by various members of the ISO team. And then we'll wrap up today's call with some next steps. So this slide here just shows where we are currently at in the ISO policy initiative stakeholder process. We are here under the proposal development stage at the draft final proposal. So with that, I will hand it over to Milosh Bozanak, our lead in policy.
Thank you, Isabella, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for a Friday morning meeting. And let me just start off by just apologizing. I've got a bit of a cold, so I may pause at certain points just to cough a little bit, catch my breath, and drink. And that cold is a courtesy of my 2-year-old daughter and her daycare. We'll also, I want to apologize that it is a Friday, so we have a morning meeting on this topic, and then there's also in the afternoon another important topic, which is the different pricing initiative that we're doing a workshop on. So a busy Friday, and thank you everybody for taking the time with us and participating in this morning discussion. As Isabella said, I think we have about 3 hours to walk through about 30 or so substantive slides. So I think there will be time for questions, and we'll pause at different points, and we encourage questions and clarifications. But we also open offline to the extent that we don't get to some of your questions. Please feel free to send those in the chat. We'll keep a record of those and reach out to you offline. Or by all means, feel free to reach out to us directly offline with any questions or clarifications, and we'd be happy to engage here ahead of the comments being due on January 4th. So with that, let me just lay out what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with a bit of the initiative background and provide an overview of the proposal. And then we're going to spend time by going into each one of the components of that proposal. So I'll start with that overview, about 3-4 slides, and then we'll go into more detail in each one of the components, pausing for questions there as well, and seeking some of your input and feedback or clarifications that you may have. So with that, let me just start with the initiative background. But I think you're familiar with this already, but let me just, if we have any newcomers as well, but this initiative really seeks to develop a more durable design for establishing scheduling priorities for wheeling through transactions across the ISO system. We're just talking about those transactions that are wheeling through the ISO system. We're not talking about transactions that are wheeling out or exporting from the ISO system. We have a framework that's currently in place that's been in place for a couple of years that we think works and has an appropriate design. But this is really focusing on that interim framework that's currently in place for establishing wheeling through priorities across the ISO system. And that interim framework is set to expire ahead of the summer of 2024 in June 1st of 2024. Just as a bit of background, the wheeling through framework that's interim in nature today allows for entities to establish wheeling through priority across the ISO system, and that priority is equal to ISO load transactions. But if they meet certain requirements, they have to effectively meet certain requirements 45 days ahead of the month. They have to demonstrate that they have a firm power supply contract to serve external load, and then they also have to demonstrate that there's a firm transmission supporting that firm power supply contract, firm transmission to the ISO border for the entirety of the month. And if those requirements are met, then the wheeling through transaction has established scheduling priority equal to load or high scheduling priority for the entirety of the month. If those requirements are not met, to the extent that entities are not able to meet some of these requirements 45 days in advance, then the framework still allows for wheel-throughs through the ISO system, but those wheel-throughs have a lower scheduling priority. So that's the design that's been in place, I think, now since about August of 2021 through today, and it's slated to go in through that June 1st of 2024. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the next couple of slides is just going to provide an overview of the proposed design to kind of foreshadow where we're going to go and some of the components to cover. This is a bit of a higher level to share that higher level picture of the design, and then really the devil is in the details that we'll cover subsequently. But the proposal that we put forward is that the ISO is going to calculate what's called available transfer capability, or short for ATC, on our interties, which then entities that are seeking to wheel through the system can reserve or seek to reserve that ATC in advance to establish that high priority wheel through, or that wheeling through scheduling priority that's equal to ISO load. And we're proposing to calculate that ATC across a 13-month horizon in monthly increments, kind of rolling 13-month horizon, as well as in a daily horizon across a 7-day rolling window. We think that these elements are fairly consistent with some of the OAT frameworks around the West, where monthly firm transmission service, for example, monthly firm ATC is calculated across similar horizons, both in the monthly and the daily time frames. And then this is going to hopefully help bridge some of the seams between the different constructs, and that entities are able to, that are seeking to wheel through the ISO, but are also wheeling through and making arrangements on other systems. They can make those arrangements in similar increments of duration and obtain that higher level of certainty across those similar increments in duration. We would calculate that ATC. In calculating that ATC, we would also, we'll talk about the different components, but one of the components is calculating what do you need for native load needs, including load growth, and setting that transmission capacity aside as a component of the methodology in calculating ATC. And so we would look to calculate those native load needs, and we put forward a proposal for how we would calculate those native load needs. Then entities, once we calculate that ATC, entities that are seeking to establish that wheeling through scheduling priority in advance, they would be able to do that and provide access to that ATC by submitting a request, by also needing to demonstrate that they have a power supply contract in place at the time that they're seeking to reserve that ATC. And then we've also provided for what we call windows during which that ATC can be requested, but also provided for a competition process based upon the underlying duration of the supply contract to the extent that there's more requests than there may be ATC available at a particular intertie that entities are requesting. We think, again, that this concept is, particularly the competition concept, is fairly consistent with some of the processes that are there in the OAT that allow for competition and preemption. But we've made some adjustments to that process, at least in this context of the ISO access to ATC, in order to provide a greater level of certainty to entities earlier in advance of when they're taking service, that effectively when they come out of that window when those requests and that competition occurs, that if they get ATC coming out of that time frame, out of those windows, then they cannot be outcompeted or preempted at a later point in time. But they have that certainty coming out, that they have the ATC for the period that they requested, and they're not subject to potential competition at a later point. If we can go to the next slide, please. We've also introduced a process, or continue to elaborate on the process that we introduced in the last proposal, that provides an opportunity for entities to submit requests for longer-term ATC, or longer-term establishment of wheeling through scheduling priority of a year or longer in duration. So we provided for a process that will study those requests, and to the extent an upgrade is needed to accommodate that request, then there's an opportunity to pursue that transmission upgrade across the ISO system and establish that scheduling priority on a longer-term basis. I think this is an important component of the design, to the extent particularly that entities may not be able to get access to limited ATC in those shorter-term horizons, and they want still that larger or a greater level of certainty on a longer-term basis for a longer duration, that they have an opportunity to be studied and potentially pursue upgrades on the system to give them that higher level of certainty. And again, we think that this is consistent with some of the processes and abilities under the OAT framework that provides an opportunity that if shorter-term service is not available, to the extent an entity wants certainty outright for a longer duration, that they have an opportunity to pursue that and fund upgrades to get that establish that wheeling through scheduling priority for whatever horizon that they're seeking. And then finally, I think we'll talk about the compensation structure for this higher wheeling through scheduling priority, the high priority equal to ISO load. We've introduced and we retained the framework with some tweaks here in this proposal, but that the entity that establishes that wheeling through scheduling priority by reserving that ATC in advance will be paying for transmission based upon the underlying duration of the supply contract that they're seeking to support and establish that wheeling through scheduling priority across the ISO system for, such that if they have a 6x16 contract, for example, across the month that they're seeking to establish that wheeling through scheduling priority for, that is the duration under which the 6x16 is what they're going to be assessed the wheeling access charge across the ISO system, whether or not that is ultimately scheduled on an hourly basis. So that's the overall framework that we're going to cover, all the way from the ATC calculation and deriving those native load needs. We're going to talk about accessing ATC and the different components of the design for accessing that limited available transfer capability. We're going to also then cover that study process and the potential to pursue upgrades across the system. And then we're going to close out with this compensation framework design. So with that, I know that I just provided an overview, and now we're going to go into each one of the components. But let me just pause here if there are any questions or clarifications on this before we get into each one of the individual details. This may be a good point to pause, but I expect most of the questions to come once we get into the detailed discussion on each one of the components.
Let's go to Lindsay.
As a reminder, pressing #2 will place you in the question queue on the phone-only line. Pressing the raised hand icon in the WebEx platform will place you in the queue. We have one question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please state your name, your affiliation.
Hi, Milos. It's Lindsay Stuckaway from NV Energy. I had a question because we offered it in comments, but I didn't see it. I didn't see a response in the paper or really through here. So I thought this would be a good time to ask this question. The paper states many times that this would be to reserve transmission that would have an equal or a priority equal to load, and we wanted to clarify if this is an equal priority to load under all situations, because currently under the OAT, the curtailment priority would be equal to load for transmission D rates. However, when a load-serving entity is not resource sufficient, then the curtailment is not equal to load for customers that have firm transmission, and they would not be curtailed during those situations. So we're kind of asking if this is going to be similar treatment as firm transmission under the OAT, or if this would be under all, I guess, circumstances that it's equal priority to load.
Yeah, good question, Lindsay. And I'll give it a shot, and then Guillermo and others feel free to jump in. But we'll talk about this a little bit in the post-HAS process. What we're referring to when we're talking about this equal priority to load is when there may be infeasibilities in the market and the market cannot accommodate all the different schedules at a particular intertie on the ISO system. How do we prioritize the different transactions and who ultimately has access to that limited transmission capacity across that particular intertie? The market, and we'll get into this when we talk about the post-HAS process, but when we talk about the getting into that feasibility on that stress conditions where there may not be sufficient transmission capacity across a particular intertie to accommodate all schedules, what the market will do is first look to adjust economic schedules, and then it would look to make adjustments to low priority schedules, potentially curtailing or adjusting those, and then it goes into the high priority schedules depending on the amount of relief that's needed on the system. But I would envision that under any of those circumstances, to the extent that there's limited capability or there's market infeasibilities associated with accommodating all schedules on an intertie, whether it's due to supply issues or transmission issues, that these priorities then come into play when allocating that limited space on that particular intertie. Let me just turn to see if Brad or Guillermo, you want to add anything to that?
Sorry, double muted. Brad Cooper, Cal ISO. The specific circumstance when we're talking about adjusting schedules and where the priority of the wheel is equal to the priority of the load, it's a circumstance when a wheel is competing for transmission capacity over imports, and without those imports, you could not meet the Cal ISO power balance constraint. So the Cal ISO power balance constraint plus the penalty price for imports it turns out to be the same as the combined power balance constraints at both ends of a wheel. So they get treated equally in the market through the post-HAS process for various reasons I won't get into right now, if that's the question you're asking. As far as D rates, I'd have to go back and relook at those details. I don't recall if we addressed those in our original HAS process or not.
Thank you, Brad. Okay, and Lindsay, once we get to the post-HAS process discussions, there's a couple of slides there as well that we can spend a bit more time on that element and walk through maybe different scenarios where these priorities become relevant.
Okay, and I just had a quick question because I think I heard their power balance constraints or the infeasibility. So that would be if there was a supply shortfall. So this would be during all circumstances then, correct? So this wouldn't be equal to OAKed firm transmission.
Can you repeat your question? You said this would not be in all circumstances? I couldn't hear you.
No, it sounds like you're saying, I just want to be super clear on this. It sounds like you're saying that even during supply shortfalls, there would be curtailment. It would not, I guess, necessarily be the same sort of transmission service that's currently under the OAT.
So curtailments and the curtailments, is not necessarily just curtailments. I'd term it scheduled adjustments because, the wheels or the imports can be adjusted up or down depending on how the results of the post-HAS process come about. Yeah, I'm not familiar with how things are handled under the oaths. I guess I can't answer that question.
Okay. Well, I guess I can give you a real quick, simple example. So if I have supply coming through California, say for a wrap or something like that, then if the BA was short, then my wheel through could be curtailed in that situation. Is that correct?
If which BA is short?
If the CAISO BA is short.
Let's go through an example. I think we might be someone is importing in the north at Malin, and they're wheeling power down out Palo Verde or whatever to serve load in the southwest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the CAISO BAA is also counting on imports coming in Malin to serve load in California. The wheel, as long as it's a high priority wheel, the wheel would only get its schedule curtailed, or I should say potentially curtailed, because a lot of this is subject to final operator review. In the case that import leg of that wheel on the northern intertie is displacing an import, and without that import, we can't meet California load. If we still have enough internal generation to meet California load and not relax the power balance constraint, and it displaces the import, the wheel would still flow. There would be no adjustment to the wheel. So okay. We've loosely used the term that that these wheels displace imports. The more precise description of the circumstances are they displace imports without which we could not meet CAISO BAA load.
Yeah, let me check here if Guillermo wants to add anything to that. Guillermo, you might be double muted.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I have been trying to call. Yeah, let me just a slightly different angle to the same description, because there are two factors at play here when we are talking about priorities for wheel-through transactions. The wheel-through transactions are not equally comparable to imports coming to the same intertie, because the wheel-through is a pairwise of an import with an export, and the priority of the wheel is not defined only by one leg of that transaction. It's defined by the difference of the priorities of the two legs of the transaction. When we compare a wheel against an import that is flowing through the same intertie, we need to make the analogy of what the equivalent wheel-through transaction would be for that CAISO import, and that is where the power balance constraint plays a role. So the wheel-through transaction is going to have the same priority as the CAISO load, and is going to be comparable to the import to meet the CAISO load only when two conditions come together. One is that there is limited intertie capacity to flow fully the wheel-through transactions and the CAISO import, but the CAISO imports are needed to meet the supply, the demand of the CAISO system. So the corresponding leg of the import coming to the intertie for the CAISO is serving the CAISO load, or the power balance constraint of the CAISO load. So we are really comparing a wheel-through transaction coming to the intertie in comparison to an import making a type of implicit wheel-through to serve CAISO load. So the two conditions that need to happen to be a comparable treatment of the wheel versus the import is only when the intertie transaction is limited. We cannot accommodate all the transactions, but also there is an inflexibility such that if we reduce the import on the intertie, we cannot fully meet our demand in the CAISO. That is when the equivalent of the priority between serving the CAISO the import that needs to be curtailed is going to have the same priority of the high priority will through. But it's only under that circumstance when the CAISO is unable to meet the CAISO load because we're going to curtail that import on that intertie. If we still have the condition that potentially could be a more likely scenario that there is limited intertie transaction capacity, but we are not infeasible to meet our own load. Naturally, by the way it's defined, the will through transaction actually has higher priority than the import coming through that intertie.
Okay. I do think these are important distinctions that really need to be made in the paper. I'm concerned that this isn't super firm service of what we're doing here. If we're calculating the available transmission that actually is available, unless there's a transmission derate, I don't understand how the transmission could be displacing another import that's meeting CAISO load. So I don't understand some of these points that are being made. I would really appreciate if this was clarified in the next iteration in the paper, because I think this is very important of what transmission service we're really getting here. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Lindsay. And yeah, let's come back to that when we get to the post-HAS process as well. But I think, as Guillermo said, there is a role there that also derates play, and is there limited transfer capability on that intertie when these priorities come into play. So thanks for raising that, and we'll make sure we'll clarify it in the paper, but as well let's talk about it more once we get to the post-HAS. Okay, let's go then to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So we'll talk about, the first thing we'll talk about is calculating ATC and the ATC methodology, and we're really trying to derive what is available at the individual interties to reserve in advance to establish that wheeling through scheduling priority. And just the ATC calculation there at top of how do you derive that available transfer capability. It's a calculation by intertie, and you look at the total transfer capability of that intertie. You subtract existing commitments, and then the different margins that a transmission provider may have. The total transfer capability, again, is that path rating generally on that intertie. What we've talked about in the paper as well, and I think this is consistent with what other transmission providers do, is I think the starting point is the total transfer capability, but to the extent that there are outages or transmission outages that are known far in advance across that, particularly that 13-month horizon, that may reduce the starting total transfer capability, because you know that outage and you know that the full amount of the facilities is not available, the full path rating is not available in a particular horizon. So your starting point may be a bit lower than the total transfer capability, what we call the operating transfer capability. And then you subtract the existing commitments, existing transmission commitments, or ETC, but this represents the transmission rights that need to be honored and the transmission needs to be set aside for the ISO, and we'll talk about this a bit next. But these are existing transmission contracts that we may have, and unfortunately it's the same term or same acronym that we use, ETC, to refer to existing transmission contracts and ownership rights, but those are some of the rights that need to be protected, as well as setting aside transmission capacity for native load needs. This is an existing transmission commitment under the FERC guidance that falls under the ETC, including load growth. And then you have the margins that potentially may be needed, the transmission reliability margin that's associated with different types of uncertainty that may need to be set aside for. And then you also have the CBM or capacity benefit margin that's associated more with set-asides for emergency conditions. But then the resulting, after you start with what's available, total transfer capability, and you subtract the different components, that resulting amount is the ATC, or the available transfer capability, that then becomes available at each intertie across different horizons to be reserved in advance to establish that wheeling through scheduling priority that we've been talking about, and that same priority that we're providing today under the interim framework, but we're just looking to provide a different method now for how that priority is accessed or established. Today, it's established by meeting certain requirements 45 days in advance. And what we're hoping to move to is establishing that same priority that applies in those same conditions, but this time you're accessing it. It's how it's made available and how it's accessed is a bit different, and it's through this ATC calculation. So if we go to the next slide, let's talk about then I think the critical component here that we've tried to focus on over the last couple of discussions and iterations of the paper has been calculating the existing transmission commitments. And for the ISO, what we would look to do is represent those existing commitments as a couple of different components. One is, as I mentioned, the existing transmission contracts. I think we could equate this to kind of legacy transmission agreements that have to be honored. And some of these are present across certain interties, but not on others. So some interties may have these, others may not. And these have to be honored. I think in some of the examples that we've shared in the past and that we've shared in the paper, in the example that we've used, for example, I think we focused on Malin and Knob. Those are the northern intertie points, facilitating imports from the north, but also they facilitate wheel-throughs north to south. And Malin, for example, has about 1,200 megawatts of existing transmission contracts that have to be honored. This is transmission that the market doesn't necessarily optimize, but these are the rights that parties have the ability to come and use. But Knob doesn't have any of these existing contracts. So existing contracts is a component here that has to be honored. And then reservations of ATC. So this is as part of this process, to the extent that somebody reserves that ATC for a particular time frame, and let's say it's for a couple of months. For those couple of months, when calculating that ATC, this is an existing commitment that somebody has reserved that ATC to establish that wheeling through scheduling priority. And then finally, I think the critical component here that's really subject to that discussion is forecasted native load needs, setting aside transmission capacity for expected native load needs, including load growth. So native load needs, before we get into how we're proposing to calculate those native load needs, I do want to highlight that I think native load needs, based on our benchmarking, and again, different transmission providers may have different practices, and I think there's a range of different practices of how different transmission providers, based on their system, based on the composition of their system, their resources, and their loads, they've chosen different methods of calculating native load needs. But nevertheless, all within the rubric of that, those are the transmission capacity that's set aside for native load is an estimation of or forecast of those native load needs across the different horizons where the ATC is calculated. And it's a forecast or estimation of that transmission capacity to serve native load. I think based on FERC guidance and what we've seen again in other transmission provider practices, this has to be a reasonable estimation and is not unduly tying up transmission capacity and precluding access to the system or unduly decreasing the ATC that may be available for others to use. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is really, I think, a key component of the proposal that I think we want to spend a little bit of time on and get some stakeholder perspectives. And I'll see what the next slide is, but this may be a good point to pause for questions or comments. Maybe after the next slide, actually, I remember now what it is about. But we've looked at different methodologies for calculating and assessing how do we forecast those native load needs and setting aside that transmission capacity at different individual interties. And ultimately, based upon what we think is the most defensible approach and gives us the most chance of success, I think, at FERC, and it's more consistent with some of the FERC guidance of being a reasonable estimation of native load needs and not unduly tying up transmission capacity. We think that the calculation of native load needs is best represented by identifying or estimating the supply that is going to be under contract from an import perspective of individual interties to serve native load. And so with that thought in mind, estimating what is going to be under contract, particularly when we're looking at a forward horizon across 13 months, what we're proposing here is to look at a couple of different components when trying to derive what is the import supply under contract or most likely to be under contract. Well, one, we would look at the resource adequacy. We would look at historical resource adequacy showings at individual enterprise as an estimation of future contracted supply that will be shown on resource adequacy plans. So we would look at the historical showings at individual enterprise, the monthly showings on the individual enterprise for resource adequacy purposes, and identify what is the volume of imports that is on those showings at those individual enterprises. And we would do this by looking at the last 2 years of most available, more recent available RA showings for a particular month, and take the higher of those two last monthly RA showings. So, for example, if we're trying to derive the native load set aside from an RA perspective for, let's say, September of 2023, we will be looking at what was the RA imports that were shown on those monthly RA plans in September of 2022 and in September of 2021, and taking the higher of those two amounts in order to allow us to account for some level of uncertainty there as well, that the RA showings may be, the last year may not be as indicative of the future RA showings, but if we look at the last couple of years and protect for the higher of, that may represent a more reasonable representation of what is likely to be shown on resource adequacy plans going forward. Similarly, we would also look at, well, what are the imports that are contracted by our load serving entities but may not be shown on resource adequacy plans? And there may be different reasons for why this may occur. There may be entities that seek out or receive an allocation of what we call import capability at different enterprise, and so they nevertheless wanted to procure additional imports to meet their obligations. But there's also different load serving entities across the ISO system that have different local regulatory structures, different local regulatory requirements for their planning reserve margins or their RA obligations, and they may need to procure some additional capacity to meet those different requirements that their local regulatory authority may have. And so they may not necessarily show in the RA plans, but it is a representation of contracted import supply at individual enterprise that is dedicated to serving native load and meeting those individual LSC's local regulatory obligations. And so we would look also similarly at, in order to project how much to set aside for these non-RA contracted imports at the individual enterprise, we would also look at the last 2 years of the volume of those contracts at individual enterprise in particular months, and then set aside for the higher of the last 2 years. Now, this is new for the ISO. This would require or encourage load serving entities to show and demonstrate and provide data on how much has been contracted historically at individual enterprise in particular months, so that we can provide an estimation of how much to set aside on a going forward basis. But we would endeavor to create a process where load serving entities can demonstrate those non-RA contracted imports in order to derive those volumes at individual enterprise and how much to protect for. So ultimately, I think the proposal here is looking at those contracted RA and non-RA imports at individual enterprise, and then setting aside transmission capacity for the higher of those contracted volumes over the last 2 years. We would also then look at, that's a forward projection, how much to set aside and estimate as a set aside for those needs across that forward 13-month horizon as an estimation or a forecast of what we can expect ultimately to be under contract. But as that last bullet there says, as we get closer to the month ahead time frame and consistent with some of the resource adequacy showing time frames, that once those contracts, once those final monthly RA plans, resource adequacy plans are submitted at that T-minus 30 time frame, 30 days ahead of the month, that there will be a true up to that set-aside transmission capacity for native load based on actual contracted import supply. So we would then look at effectively, in this upper part of the proposal, on those first couple of bullets, we're estimating what those showings are going to be based on historical showings that were under contract. Now at that T-minus 30 time frame, when those actual contracts are executed and shown on the RA plans, there will be a true up on the amount of transmission capacity to set aside here for native load on that individual intertie. So we would look at what has been the actual RA showing at Malin, at Knob, at TV West, at the intertie points, but what also has been the showing for contract and non-RA supply that entities may have under contract, load serving entities may have under contract, but did not show it on those RA plans. And this, again, would also require a new process on our end that, in addition for entities demonstrating the resource adequacy showings, that they are encouraged to provide non-RA contracted import information and volumes at individual interties so that we can then account for and do that true up at the T-minus 30 time frame. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll pause for questions there, because I think these next two concepts go together. But the other component here that we would set aside transmission capacity for is for load growth, for native load growth year over year. And this is an explicit component that FERC allows for the set aside of transmission capacity for load growth. And we would look to then have to derive how much of that load growth is going to be met by the intertie, by imports across different interties. And so what we would do is, what we're proposing is we would look at, based on the differences in forecasts from one year over the next, the CEC load forecast, California Energy Commission load forecasts that are made available and that are also utilized in setting the resource adequacy obligations. We would look at using those forecasts to derive the load growth from year over year, and effectively then we would look to attribute a portion of that load growth being served by imports. I think the current rate of load growth is roughly 2 to 3% year over year. I think in the future, with increases in electrification across the state, we can see that load growth rate increasing. I think upwards of 5%, if not higher. But that just gives you an estimation of what we're talking about, load growth. But a portion of that load growth we would have to attribute that is being served by imports. Not necessarily, I think it's fair to say that not necessarily all the load growth is going to be served by those imports. There's internal resources that may contribute to service of that load growth. So I think that the question for us is deriving how much of that load growth is going to be met by imports. And what we would propose to do is, at least as a starting point, look at a more simplistic assessment of deriving a ratio of, based on historical resource adequacy showings, what's been the ratio of imports to total resource adequacy capacity shown, such that if imports make up 10, 20% of all the contracted resource adequacy supply that load serving entities are obtaining, then we could say that 10 to 20% of that load growth is attributable to likely being served by imports. And then we would set aside, if the load growth is 500 megawatts, we would look at 10 to 20%, depending on what that ratio is, 10 to 20% of that 500 megawatts then being attributed to being served by imports. And then we would distribute effectively that 100 or whatever the megawatt amount ends up being, distribute that across the different interties, and that's an additional set aside of transmission capacity across the interties. So that's an additional component that just goes beyond the concept that we talked about on the last slide by looking at historical RA showings and non-RA contract and imports. This is an additional component that sets aside an additional amount of capacity, recognizing that there may be increases in those showings, whether it's RA or non-RA contract and imports, to serve that load growth at individual interties. And then we would also propose to account for a level of uncertainty through the transmission reliability margin, or the TRM, and setting aside transmission capacity at individual interties for that TRM component as well. And what we propose in the paper is upwards of as a starting point, upwards of 6% of the total transfer capability of individual interties being set aside for this amount of for uncertainty associated with transmission system topology. This represents a certain smaller level of outage risk that would be accounted for, outage risk of transmission facilities, since we may not necessarily, on the current practices, receive transmission outage information up to 13 months in advance. It does come in a bit closer in time, but this would allow us to set aside a little bit of a buffer or to account for that uncertainty that there may be some additional outages that were not accounted for that may come in a bit later, and that's the uncertainty within the TRM. As well as variations in generation dispatch. I think this is a common element that entities that have a TRM set aside transmission capacity for, but this accounts for uncertainty related to how generation may be dispatched, and in particular for us, what this represents is the recognition that in certain periods of time, we may depend more upon imports than upon other resources internally, whether you have resource outages or other conditions on the system, particularly in those net load peak periods where solar is ramping down and you have a greater dependence on more flexible internal generation, but also potentially additional imports. Setting aside an amount of transmission capacity, I think we've specified in the paper upwards of 2% on individual interties, not necessarily every intertie, but on individual interties where we historically depend upon imports, setting aside some additional transmission capacity to recognize that there may be additional imports in those instances to meet those variabilities across the system and the variation in generation dispatch to the extent that some resources are unavailable and as we're trying to meet those net load peak periods. And then finally, setting aside an amount of transmission capacity as uncertainty for the concept of aggregate load forecast, which is under the NERC standards, it's an explicit component as well that TRM can be set aside for uncertainty, but to the extent that there are certain changes in conditions and load conditions, setting aside of a small amount of that uncertainty on individual interties, not just necessarily squarely on one intertie, but when you spread this across individual interties, it represents a more sizable amount of capacity to account for potential changes in load conditions, and you may depend upon additional imports to a greater extent in those instances as well. So the thought is, the proposal is then that when you're calculating that ATC, you're setting aside transmission capacity for existing commitments, and the native load commitments there are represented by an estimation of historical contracted import supply, whether it's resource adequacy or non-resource adequacy that didn't make it on a plan, but also account for an element of load growth. And then as well, there's, as I noted here, the last point, setting aside for, transmission capacity for different types of uncertainty on different interties that account for the potential change in conditions, including transmission outages, variations in generation dispatch, and then changes in the aggregate load forecast. If we could just go on to the next slide just to see if I missed anything here. Otherwise, let me just see. Yeah, so let's go back then. I think let's go back a couple of slides and let's pause here then for questions and comments on the calculating the native load component of the equation.
As we move to the Q&A portion of today's call, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon. You will hear a beep tone when you are unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. There are no hands raised in the question queue.
Okay. Well, let's maybe can continue, and then at the end we'll pause as well as people are absorbing some of these items if they want to share any perspectives. But let us spend a little bit of time just talking about the internal transmission network impacts. I think a number of commenters asked for clarification on whether we're calculating ATC here on just the interties, or are we also calculating ATC on the internal network and the export points? And if not, why not? And we also had a number of stakeholders request that there be an opportunity or an annual assessment or a periodic assessment of the adequacy or sufficiency of the internal network to be able to support different volumes of transactions and imports as well as wheel through. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about this. I'll start. I know Catalin is going to have to jump off here in about 5 minutes, but maybe Catalin, I'll start to save you from having to pause. I'll start, and then we'll Robert, feel free to jump in. I'll pause at certain instances and see where that takes us. But the proposal does focus on the calculation of ATC on the ATC of the interties and not across the internal path. I think in the paper we've described a couple of reasons for that. I think one reason is that in order to be able to derive ATC on the internal path, I think that creates a certain level of additional complexity, but I think also additional challenges, such that I think in order for us to do that, I think it would drive us towards having to require that internal resources also reserve transmission in advance in order to be able to appropriately calculate that ATC. And I think that is a significant there's a significant departure from the current market structure, and I think that's a significant impact on the market if we have to tie internal resources with a particular reservation of ATC in order to be able to account for how much is available and calculate ATC. But also, I think it would require, obviously, export resources are looking to export to also reserve that ATC in advance and calculate those ATC impacts on the different internal paths. And again, we think that that's a significant departure from the current market design. It may be unnecessary in this instance. What we're proposing effectively is, and we'll talk about this here on the next couple of slides, but is we've looked at some of the historical data under more stress system conditions, and we believe that it indicates that under some of those more stress system conditions, and we'll talk about September 2022 and September 2020, some of that data, but we think that under those stress system conditions, the system was able to support the different conditions that were materializing on the grid, including high volume of imports and high volume of wheel-throughs across the system, such that it gives us a level of confidence that as a starting point of this design, we may not need to necessarily calculate ATC across those different internal paths. Rather, what we're proposing, I think, and consistent with what some of the stakeholders have suggested, is that we would continue to do annual assessments to evaluate the robustness of the internal system, internal network, particularly those flows north to south across Path 26, Path 15 potentially, but continuing to evaluate the robustness and the ability of the internal network to support the different volumes of imports and wheel-through transactions across the system. And we would, as part of the proposal, we're proposing to do that effectively, that we would, you'll see the kind of level of assessment that we've done here in the next couple of slides for certain of the more recent stress system conditions. But we would propose to do a similar assessment, including through a power flow analysis if necessary, and working with stakeholders to derive that, but do that assessment to continue to evaluate the robustness of that system, particularly as resources retire and as resources come on to the system, to make sure that the system can support a certain volume of wheel-throughs and how the system would react in more stress system conditions to the extent that we had a certain utilization of those internal paths that are either transferring generation from the north to the south of the system or wheeling through the system. And so we're committed as part of this process to continue to monitor those internal network conditions And to the extent that through those annual assessments that would look to evaluate under more stress system conditions, what can those internal paths continue to support? We will continue to monitor, and based on that information, then we can potentially evolve this design if necessary, and if necessary, finding ways of accounting for or making certain assumptions about availability of certain internal transmission paths, but that would be short of necessarily having to calculate ATC and require that all internal resources reserve ATC in advance, or otherwise exports as well reserve that ATC. So let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so this may be a little bit small for folks to read, but if it is, we posted these slides on the initiative website as well as in the paper, and if this is a bit too small, feel free to use those documents as well. But we've looked to what do we experience during the highest load conditions in September of 2022, this most recent heat wave. And then the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what did we see and what we see on these different paths in September of 2020. That gives us at least a level of confidence to be able to start this program with, or this assessment with, just calculating ATC on the inner ties and monitor the implications and impacts on the internal paths through these annual assessments, and then potentially evolve the design if necessary. But as you may know, in the September 2022 heat wave, it was a prolonged heat wave with high load conditions, particularly here in California, while it may have been a bit cooler and more reasonable in some of the other regions of the West. But in those peak load conditions, we had sizable volumes of imports and wheel-throughs, and we did not cut those wheel-throughs, and we did not see any impacts on internal system reliability constraints. We didn't see any impacts. The flows and the volume of flows on path 15 and on path 26 did not reach their limits effectively. And so what contributes to that is the robustness of resources both in the north and in the south of the system that allow an opportunity for the system to redispatch those resources across the grid to manage different congestions across the internal network, including across these internal paths through the middle of the system. I think it's also important to remember that generally what happens in these more stressed system conditions when loads are high in different areas of the system, local resources that are located in the northern part and the southern part of the system are also dispatched to manage local congestion, such that they're reducing or contributing to the reduction in the north to south flows and the loading of those paths across the internal portion of the system. Not saying that not necessarily there's generation from the north of the system being dispatched to serve load in the south and vice versa, but in those more stress system conditions, local areas as well are facing high load conditions such that those local resources are utilized more and dispatched more to meet those local area needs, and that reduces some of the loading on the middle of the system, on the facilities across the middle of the system, such that it can support imports as well coming in to serve on both ends, coming in to serve the load in the south or load in the north or through the system, as well as wheel-throughs through the system. It creates more room on the system to support those wheels through the system. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so looking more at the September 2020 conditions, the conditions were a little bit different than in the heat wave of 2022. As you remember, in 2022, the heat wave, this more recent heat wave, was really more concentrated, high load conditions and a heat wave across California, not as much across some of the other, or at least to more manageable levels across the other areas of the West. And so we depended a lot upon, in those instances, on support and help from our neighbors to be able to manage these conditions. In September of 2020, the conditions were a bit more different in that, yes, we had high loads, but the heat wave and the high load conditions were more broadly spread across the West, and including the Southwest. And so we depended more upon the imports from the Northwest to help manage some of those conditions. And so in those instances, what we saw in September 2020, we did see that both PATH 26 and the COI trend upward, the loading reaching fairly high levels, with the COI reaching its limit during those periods. And PATH 26 as well, as you can see, I think in that graph on the upper left corner, PATH 26 as well, we have a proxy path rating of 4,000 megawatts on PATH 26, and in certain instances that the flows there, the loading exceeded that 4,000 megawatts, but that's not necessarily the limit of PATH 26. In those instances where that path rating and the is reached, we really manage the loading on PATH 26 based upon interactions with other loading on other paths across the system. So because we reached, even though we reached 4,000 megawatts and above of flows or loading on PATH 26, it did not mean that necessarily we encountered conditions that the grid could not manage, because again, PATH 26 is a conglomeration of different facilities, different entities, and we were still able to manage the conditions and the flows north to south, because in those more post-contingency events, the conditions on PATH 26 in particular are also dependent upon different loadings on different paths across the system. And so that reaching 4,000 megawatts of loading on PATH 26 does not necessarily mean that we reach the limit on PATH 26 that it caused certain impacts, reliability impacts on the internal grid, because like I said, we manage those limitations on PATH 26 based on once you get to that 4,000 megawatt proxy limit, we also base it on the conditions that may be going on in the loading on other transmission paths on the system. So the system was still able to support a robust volume of transactions across the system. So if we go into the next slide. Okay. I think I reached the limit there. Let's then go back and pause here as well. But let me just test if there's anything that I know that Catalin, he's going to come back around 10:20ish or so. But Robert, if there's anything that you want to add here to this discussion that I may have either misstated or didn't elaborate on further, anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, this is Robert. I just, on the PATH 26 going over its limit, my understanding is that in the real-time contingency analysis, that analysis is what allows us to go above the 4,000 megawatt planning limit. They run the actual contingencies under the actual system conditions, and it turns out with that exact information, we can go over the 4,000 megawatt limit. I guess that's what you're saying, but that's how I would say it.
That's right. And no, thank you, Robert, and that's a better way of expressing it. So really appreciate you jumping in. Okay, maybe we can pause here as well if there are any questions. Otherwise, we can then move on to the accessing ATC process, which is another important component of the design.
It looks like we have two questions in the queue, so let's go to Steve.
Hey, Milos. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Couple questions, if you don't mind. Number one, I think I would echo and support Lindsay's request for kind of additional detail. I'm just still trying to get a better handle on priorities of the wheels versus native load in the real time. And I guess to that point, and apologies if this question doesn't make any sense, but I'm trying to equate, at least from a real-time priority perspective, would you say the proposal here is going to mirror the priorities in place today under the existing high priority wheel through framework? Does that make sense?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time, Steve?
I'm trying to compare and contrast as far as real-time scheduling priorities and, the application of penalty prices and whatnot in the real time, how the proposed framework, is it really identical to the high priority wheel through framework that's in place today?
Yeah. No, great question. Yeah, and yes, the intent is that the way that the priorities apply is equivalent to the way that they apply today, that they trigger in the same conditions, the penalty pricing structure and the triggering of those priorities applies the same. What we're really trying to describe here is just a different way of establishing that priority. Today, that priority is established by meeting certain requirements 45 days in advance, that you have a contract, that you have transmission without consideration as to is the system able, is there enough ATC on the internet. If you can meet those requirements, you got that scheduling priority for the month.
Yeah,
that is equal to load.
And apologies. I understand, everything that has to happen, 45 days in advance today, and how you're going to replace that framework with the ATC construct you're talking about, or you just spoke to.
That's right.
I understand that. I'm just trying to, I think it's related to Lindsay's question, just trying to get a firm handle on, so to speak, of the priorities in real time and under which circumstances you may or may not have, the wheels may or may not have a priority equal to load. And so you're saying in the real-time framework, it's essentially going to be the same the way it's applied today. And I guess a question, and if you're going to get to this later, that's fine. Or if you do want to point me, I think it may have been included in the summer assessment and Guillermo's analysis with respect to what happened to the high priority wheels this past summer. I don't know if you're going to touch on that later. I haven't looked at your slides, but so I'm
hey, this is Brad. My audio dropped off, but I'm back. But it sounded like the question got answered anyway. What I was going to say was, mechanically, the post-hash process will work the same. What the difference is the inputs used to determine the various ratios that you adjust schedules by. There's at least a couple elements under this proposal where the inputs could be different, and also obviously the criteria to get the high priority wheel status. But as far as implementing high priority wheels mechanically in the post-hash process, it would work the same. Guillermo might correct me with some nuance, but at a high level, I believe that's true.
Yeah, no, you got it, Brad. That's right. I mean, and we'll get to that. Steve, if we can hold that question, we have a section here on the post-hash process where we'll talk through what those differences are in how that then ratio is determined for affording that pro rata priority. And that's where I think we can then jump into a couple of examples to illustrate and both answer, Lindsay's question more in detail, as well as your question, and walk through a couple of scenarios as well on when these priorities then become relevant.
Okay, that's great. I'll wait for that. And just maybe if you could answer real quickly, is there a section in the summer assessment that discusses what happened to the high priority wheels? Apologies, I just don't recall.
Yeah. You're referring to this the heat wave in particular.
The heat wave analysis.
Yeah. There is a section there that talks about the impacts on wheel through transactions, and that I believe that we didn't curtail any during those events.
Okay, so that'll give some insight as to what happens to those wheels and what would happen to the wheels under the proposal under stress conditions. Okay, all right, thanks. And then finally, and apologies, one last question, just on you may have mentioned it, I can't remember, but in the forward time frame, whether it's the year ahead, month ahead, on your evaluation of ATC, are you making any adjustments for anticipated load bias. And so that's kind of one question. And then in the real-time time frame, obviously ISO operators could be conducting load bias, which, if I understand correctly, obviously, or not obviously, but could result in increased imports into the CAISO system. Um, um, are you going to protect the wheel through ATC at all from the impacts of that load biasing? And once again, I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah. So in that longer term horizon that we just talked a little bit ago about, there is a component. I don't know if you're maybe meaning the same thing in that longer term horizon, but there's a component for load growth that we talked about that we would account for load growth. Ultimately, what we're looking to set aside that transmission capacity for is for imports that are contracted to load serving entities, to ISO load serving entities, which includes resource adequacy and non-RA. Once you get into those shorter term horizons, into the daily or hourly, to the extent that these are economy imports that are just that are not necessarily contracted for, and are just economy imports that were bid at the interties that the market may find economic and allow. Those will not make it into that post-HAS pro rata assessment. Really, what we're protecting through that pro rata post-HAS assessment, where we're looking at what are you affording equal priority to wheel-throughs and import transactions serving load. It's those import transactions that are associated with contracts, and so those will be your RA plus non-RA, not your regular necessarily economy imports that may not have a relationship. Such that ultimately, if the wheel-through has acquired ATC, they have that wheeling-through priority if they exercise it, and they're protected, at least in that pro rata assessment in the post-HAS process, when we compare the wheel-throughs to the imports that have contracted supply.
Okay.
And we'll get to that as well in post-HAS.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe I'll come back to it in post-HAS. But yeah, and so it's really the relationship. The load biasing could result in increased imports. Those are likely to be, economic bids in real time, not necessarily related to RA contracts. So I'm just, once again, trying to think through the relative priorities among the high priority wheel, the RA imports, and economy imports. So, okay. I'll wait till the future discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
All right, next caller, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I have a few questions. The first one's sort of a follow-up to the Lindsay's and Steve's, and if you want to talk about it later, you could tell me. But in terms of if an intertie that's been, let's say fully subscribed between the native load needs and the wheeling reservations, if it gets derated, and as Greg described, the market will still try to solve and to meet the load, but if it can't, would the curtailments be pro rata to the capacity of the line, or would it be pro rata, relative to CAISO load versus the wheel through?
Yeah. So the adjustments that would be made in that HAS or post-HAS process are relative to an individual intertie. So if there are derates or other conditions that there are feasibilities associated with a particular intertie, it's the prioritization and the pro rata assessment between high priority wheels and those load transactions or imports effectively serving load would be based solely upon the conditions on that intertie, not necessarily on the pro rata is not determined based upon the entire wheel throughs on the system, on all the interties and the imports and all the interties, but it's unique to that particular intertie, depending on what those conditions are. If that's what you're
and you'd be looking at the tagged transactions on that intertie to apply any of the adjustments if you needed to, if the market couldn't.
Yeah, you'll be looking at in that HAS process. So you'll be looking in that HAS and the post HAS process. You'd be looking at the schedules that are coming out of those markets in order to effectuate. First you adjust the low priority transactions, and then you go into if you need to, then you depending on the amount of relief that's needed, then you go into the high priority transactions and potentially in that post HAS process having to do the pro rata assessment between high priority wheels and low priority wheels. But I think similar to what I think entities are familiar in other contexts, you first, depending on the amount of relief that you need, you first see do you need to make any adjustments to economic transactions, then you go into the low priority. If you resolve the issues with low priority, then you don't need to impact higher priority transactions. But only if you need additional relief do you go into if that capacity is even further limited such that you only have enough to allocate between high priority transactions. That's where you apply it on a pro rata basis between high priority wheels and those load transactions.
Okay, great, thanks. And then in terms of the TRM, this is basically 6%. If I understand it, you won't do it on every single intertie. You would apply it, to probably the important interties that tend to be used for these transactions, right? So
that's right.
It's either on or off your application.
It may be different it may be, it's upwards of 6%. So on the interties that are most utilized, you would see a 6% TRM. But on the other interties that are less prevalent, less utilized, there's maybe a lesser risk of outage or lesser risk of, lesser dependency on for variations in generation dispatch or low. The TRM may be a bit lower. But I think on every intertie, you're going to see at least probably a 2% TRM accounting for the outage element. It just may not be on every intertie up to 6%.
Got it. And I think the paper talked about this, but did you look at how that 6% compares to what other entities are doing for their kind of more important interties?
Yeah. I mean, we've looked at, and I think I have to remind myself if it's in the benchmark at the end of the document that has TRM in it as well. But we've looked at other transmission providers in the West, and they account for different things in the TRM. And we also looked at the other ISOs and RTOs, and I think MISO in particular, and I can't recall if PJM, but I think MISO in particular has a percentage approach derivation where it's clear upfront that a certain percentage of the flow gate or path or intertie capability is set aside for a transmission reliability margin, and then they spell out 2% for this, 3% for that, or 2% for other points. We think that that's within the range of other transmission providers. They may not necessarily apply it in the same kind of context as attributing a percentage amount to it, but they look at different conditions. I'm setting aside for a risk of XYZ, and it's 300 megawatts. So it ultimately equates to a similar range of TRM compared to the total transfer capability of a particular path or intertie or flow gate. So we think that this is within that range. TRM is generally not, a significant portion of the set aside of transmission capacity. Your native load commitments, your existing contracts are that bulky portion of your set aside of transmission on a particular intertie, and then the margins are just that. They're smaller components that account for a level of uncertainty on particular interties. And they're not usually like your 20 or 30% or 50% of the capacity of an intertie, but it's really those margins to account for uncertainty. And when you consider that, across a multitude of interties and a multitude of what other entities do across, again, other internal flow gates or paths, when you consider that not in isolation as to a unique and a singular intertie, but you consider that in the larger scheme of multiple interties and multiple flow gates, multiple paths, it adds up. It can add up to provide that protection for uncertainty that may materialize. So what we've tried to do here is, again, illustrate that this is not necessarily something that should be looked at in the context of a singular intertie, but when you set aside 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of TRM across multiple interties, that can add up to a reasonable and a sizable amount of transmission capacity that can support additional transactions if necessary, if the conditions change.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking of is, it's sort of that point is where do you allocate it to which interties do you allocate those quantities, and is the 6% enough on a particular intertie, or should it be higher on that intertie and 0 on other interties? But anyway,
fair question. Yeah, fair point. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So, and I just have just a couple of thoughts about the potential impacts on California's RA program, and just sort of thinking through a hypothetical. If you had a particular intertie where the last 2 years RA and non-RA showings were lower than the MIC for that intertie, and there was ATC available, and it was requested and granted for wheel throughs, and in the forward-looking process, and then in the California program, entities make the monthly showings. If then parties who had MIC increase their actual RA showings enough so that the combination of all the RA showings and the wheels that had been awarded are more than the 6% that had been set aside, so now you're sort of over the TTC for the month. What would you do? What would the implications of that be? Do parties still get to rely on that RA in the monthly showing?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in that instance, let me just make sure I've captured the scenario. But what you're saying is, if ultimately the RA showings and the non-RA contracted imports end up being of a greater volume than you may have forecasted in that going forward horizon that set your ATC, and the ATC was all reserved, and more was shown that even goes above and beyond in a particular intertie than the uncertainty component that you may have set aside. In that instance, I think this is a common risk that I think other transmission providers around the West also face, where that forecast or an estimation, there's a risk there that it may not be accurate even when you set aside certain margins for it. But what we would expect in that instance is, if there's no additional ATC, obviously this is not looking to carve out. If somebody has ATC, it doesn't carve out that transmission capacity and afford them a physical right that only they hold, and if they don't schedule, the transmission is not made available to the market. The market is still going to seek to optimize all of the transmission that it's available to it, including, let's just say, Malin. We're still going to look to optimize the full capability of Malin to support transactions to the extent, and that means that even excess RA and non-RA contracted imports they're not precluded from bidding into the market. They can continue to meet their obligations of offering that supply into the market and bidding that in. The market is going to accommodate those to the extent that they're economic, just like it does today. But the implication is just that once you get to that post-HASP process, when you're doing that ratio of what's the volume of high priority wheel throughs to load transactions that you're comparing, when ultimately you have to make adjustments to those transactions. What I think that means within that process is that when you're representing load, you're representing it ultimately only by that amount that you were able to set aside transmission capacity for it, such that, for example, if we set aside 2,000 megawatts of transmission at Knob, for example, for native load, but ended up showing 2,500 megawatts of RA imports and contracted supply, and when we've sold the rest of the ATC to support high priority wheel through transactions, those 2,500 megawatts of RA imports can continue to bid into the market. The market is going to, as it does today, continue to economically dispatch or commit those. But what it means is that when you get into that post-HAS process, and now you have to afford that prioritization into those high priority transactions, you're affording the priority to the volume of wheel throughs that have reserved ATC that have established that priority, and then the ISO load component is represented by the amount of transmission capacity that you were able to set aside, which would be that, for example, that 2,000 megawatts, even if the showings ended up being significantly higher because you didn't have any additional necessarily capacity to set aside for it. But that's what that means in that instance when you get into those conditions.
Yeah, thanks. And then if you have the opposite situation where going into the month there was, between the shown RA and the ATC requests, there's still more, the wheeling requests, there's still more ATC. It seems like there ought to be a mechanism to be able to, for California load serving entities, be able to use that for RA, even if they didn't have MIC, because it's like there's capacity there, and it seems like there's no recognition in this monthly process. I mean, you have something in the daily process where California load serving entities could essentially get more daily, but you don't have it in the monthly. And we raised this in the MIC enhancements where we had asked for a process to revisit the MIC on a monthly basis, and the answer we got was, well, it's too complicated to do that. And yet now we're doing that for these wheeling transactions. It seems like we need to do that for the California load serving entities. And you're not proposing that. I credit you. You're allowing a consideration of the non-RA contracts, but we wouldn't be able to count on those to meet the RA obligations. So it sort of puts us in a diminished position.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. I think what we specified in the proposal was that if we do find ourselves in the situation where there is a remaining ATC that hasn't been reserved by that T-30 time frame effectively, so 30 days before the start of the month, and there's lingering ATC available that now nobody has accessed, that ATC then could be utilized to account for that additional, because the way that the timing works is that you're now within kind of the month. So let's say today is December. So by, I think the T-30 time frame is, let me just work this out in my head. I think February 1st or January 31st, whenever it is, this is when the final RA plan is submitted, along with the non-RA contracts for I think I think March or it's either February 1st is when that final plan comes in for March, that T-minus 30 time frame. And so that already gets us into that daily. We're no longer selling that ATC now in February because you're within the month. If there's any ATC that hasn't been reserved, and entities had plenty of opportunity to reserve that across the different horizons, if there's more RA plus non-RA contracted supply that is shown, and there's remaining ATC, that remaining ATC in that monthly time frame that would be utilized to support that difference in the showings. If there's anything above and beyond that, then the entities contract for, that load serving entities contract for within the day ahead, and nearer term time frames, that's where we've said, you would buy for that ATC if there's any remaining along with other requests. But I think what we've noted in the paper is that in that instance, there's remaining ATC, it can be accessed, that nobody has reserved, it can be accessed to make up that difference between what we estimated was going to be shown and what was actually shown.
I appreciate that, but that doesn't, it seems like we need a mechanism to be able, for parties to be able to get credit to meeting their monthly RA obligation. In other words, essentially, if there's been unused MIC and there, well, it's not even just MIC, if there's intertype capability, it hasn't been reserved, hasn't been reserved based on the look back RA historical showings. It hasn't been allocated to, reserved in a 13-month ahead, some prior 13-month ahead process for wheels. There's capacity there. If somebody makes an RA showing in their 45-day ahead showing, even if they didn't have the MIC, if there's capability available, we need a mechanism for those parties to get credit for that.
Yes, thank you, Milos.
Okay.
Yeah, Milos, just one second. Just 1 second. The maximum import capability is a simultaneous number that is calculated. The wheel throughs calculations are done at each intertie. There are quite non-simultaneous basis. So that the two are not the same, and that's why this proposal does not link anything to the MIC calculation. So please, let's not confuse the two. And the ATC available on each branch group, that does not mean that we can simultaneously import that under MIC. So let's keep the MIC discussion separate from the ATC calculations because they are different. Thank you.
Okay, and Doug, yeah. I think you have a fair question as well. Is there additional mechanisms that can be allowed for entities to access that ATC if there's any ATC left in advance to the extent that a load serving entity needs it? I think we can look at that. Like I said, in the proposal we put forward that any remaining ATC, that if there's any remaining ATC at those interties at that T-minus 30 time frame when those actual showings come in and nobody has reserved it, that ATC can be applied towards ultimately supporting those showings. But if you're looking for something beyond that, noted in your comments, we'll certainly consider it. And I do want to apologize. I think we have been kind of lingering a bit on different questions and multi-portion questions that we're getting a bit short on time. I don't have necessarily visibility in how many more questions we have, Isabella, but I think maybe we can take one more, and then I think we need to move on and encourage stakeholders to submit if there's other questions. Let us know offline, send us a note. We'd be happy to get together with all of you.
Yeah, let's take one more quick question. So let's go to Dan Williams, and then we'll go ahead and move on.
Hi, thanks for taking the questions. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just building on the question that Steve asked about load bias. On September 4th, 5th, 6th, from the data that DMM published, it looks like CAISO operators were making out-of-market purchases at the interties in the 900 to 1200 megawatt range over evening peak. Where does that get picked up, either on a study basis or going forward, once this policy is in place? Is that something that you would expect would be available because of the 6% TRM, or is that a valid use of that 6% TRM, or would the operators at that point just have to make a real-time assessment of ATC and hope that it's there to do the out-of-market purchases on?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and I'll give it a shot, and then let's see if Guillermo wants to talk a bit about in the context of, I think actually he might have dropped off, but he'll be back in a bit. But ultimately, what the design, I think it's important to recognize that the ATC here that we're talking about doesn't necessarily drive what the market can or cannot optimize. I tried to note this earlier, that the ATC here calculation is to help identify how many wheel-throughs can we afford a higher priority to by reserving that transmission, that ATC in advance. It doesn't mean that if an entity gets that ATC and they don't use it, that the market cannot use it. It's not a physical right. The market is going to still optimize, the full 3,200 or whatever the transfer capability is across a particular intertie to support different types of transactions. Ultimately, these priorities come into play, as we'll talk about in that post-hash process, come into play once you get into some of those more corner case scenarios where now either things have changed on the grid, there's a significant deray, there's significant shortages of supply, there's limited ability to bring in capacity across an intertie, creating infeasibilities. That's where these priorities come into play. But the ATC, the market is not going to be looking at, how much ATC do I still have left and can I optimize it? The market is still going to continue optimizing in real time, a day ahead, based on all the different transactions that are submitted, economic, business, self-schedules. Is going to continue to optimize the full capability of the system. It's just that, again, those priorities may come into play if we get into some of these corner case scenarios. In terms of load biasing, to the extent that there's load biasing that leads to the procurement of additional, I'm assuming that's what you're referring to the extent there's that operator load biasing that may increase some procurement of additional imports by the market.
It's really just an analog to exceptional dispatch of on-system resources. It's them making purchases from resources that either didn't clear or whatever the case may be. But we don't have great visibility into sort of what that looks like all throughout the year. Just have seen some data published for the heat wave. But if operators are consistently making significant out-of-market purchases on the interties, that feels like something that is part of maintaining load service for California, and just curious if that gets picked up anywhere, kind of in this whole discussion, because I haven't seen it or heard it mentioned anywhere, and yet 1,000 megawatts is not immaterial, and if it's more in some hours and we just haven't seen that data, it feels like a material piece of the puzzle. But I can leave it there. I know you're short on time, and just maybe that's something.
The current proposal, unless this is, again, the operators are going to continue to have that ability to make additional out-of-market purchases, but under the current proposal, in terms of setting that ratio of high priority wheel-throughs to the ratio of import serving load, what we're proposing is that those be the ones that are under RA contract plus non-RA import supply. I think we've left an open question here that we want to talk about once we get to the post-hash process. Does that include CPM transactions? But beyond that, the simple procurement of economy imports wouldn't necessarily be something that makes it into that ratio evaluation of ISO imports and comparison to high priority wheels. The market can still continue to procure those economically, but it wouldn't be something that's part of that assessment in the post-hash process of equating high priority wheels to imported supply serving load. That's limited to that imported supply that's under RA plus non-RA contracted imports, plus that open question that I think we left for discussion on CPM contracted supply. Okay. So if there are any more lingering questions from stakeholders, in the interest of time, I think we should move on, and then by all means, we'll put it in the chat or send us an email offline. We're going to look at these questions afterwards, and we're going to look to get back to you. Maybe, I think those have a name associated with them. We'll look to get back to you via email. But also, if you have more questions, just feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to get together here. Another important component of the overall design is accessing ATC. Once you've calculated that ATC, how do you access it? And what are the requirements for obtaining that ATC to be able to establish that higher scheduling priority equal to load? What we're proposing is that in accessing that ATC, we retain, similar to the straw proposal, the power supply contract requirement to establish that scheduling priority, which means that the same requirement that we've identified earlier, that it has to be a demonstrated, executed firm power supply contract to serve external load, or it's a contract that is in place, but its final execution is contingent upon the securing or wheeling through scheduling priority across the ISO system, or alternatively, the entity owns the resource. And the design really seeks to ensure the requirement of this contractual relationship really seeks to ensure that load-serving entities that have demonstrated that need for scheduling priority, that have made steps towards securing supply to be able to wheel it through the ISO system, have access to that limited ATC as compared to somebody that hasn't made the necessary arrangements and maybe just looking for that ATC in the hopes of landing an arrangement down the line. The expectation here is that we're trying to ensure that those entities that have demonstrated a real need for that capacity and for that higher scheduling priority have access to that, particularly because ATC and that willing to priority is limited. We have made changes to this aspect. If you recall, in the straw proposal, we proposed you have to have a contract, plus you have to prepay that transmission charge in order to get access to it. We've removed the prepayment requirement, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation as well, but there's no longer a requirement that you have to prepay transmission as a condition to accessing the ATC. So it's just this contractual requirement. And this contractual requirement could be met by either the supplier that's under contract or the load-serving entity that ultimately is contracting with that supplier. I think what we've noted in the paper as well, we would look there to be an attestation that demonstrates this requirement has been met. And we want to get some feedback on, does it make sense as well to get the other counterparty to acknowledge this arrangement as well as a condition of establishing this priority, that there is indeed a contract and that can be attested by both parties that are party to the contract. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to walk through the different components of the access to ATC portion, and then we can pause for questions there. But we've also proposed reservation windows that effectively, both in the monthly and the daily horizon, there's a period of time where all entities submit requests at the same time or in the same window time frame, such that ultimately facilitates what we'll talk about in the next slide, but it's the competition of those requests in determining who to award that transmission capacity to or that ATC to between the different requests. But there will be a window in the monthly horizon, and as we propose it, is a two-week window at the beginning of the month where requests are submitted for ATC. So entities have, we're not necessarily evaluating these requests on a first-come, first-served basis, but we're opening up this window where all the requests that come in within that two-week window that will be evaluated concurrently based on that competition process that we noted. And in the monthly horizon, if that week window is 2 weeks, every month we open up that window for submission of requests, and entities within that window then are able to request ATC across the horizon for which we've calculated the ATC. So it should be effectively cross that 13-month horizon. So let's say we're in the January window, January of 2023 now. In the first 2 weeks of January, we're opening that window for submission of requests, and you can request ATC anywhere across that horizon for which we've calculated ATC, which should be that 13-month horizon. And then the next month, same thing. You get those first 2 weeks and you request ATC anywhere within the horizon that we've calculated the ATC for. Some of the numbers may be updated of ATC because in the prior month, somebody may have reserved that ATC, so the numbers may be a bit lower or different, but that allows that ability to reserve ATC within this window. Similarly, in the daily time frame, there will be a window where, as we proposed it, and we're looking for some stakeholder feedback, is this a reasonable window based on when you do your arrangements? So a 5-hour period, ranging from 7 a.m. to noon each day, where entities then can request ATC across that 7-day horizon. So, for example, on Friday, 7 a.m. to noon, entities can submit requests for the next days across that 7-day horizon where we calculate the ATC, and they can request any ATC amount across that window. And again, the purpose of these windows is to ensure that these requests can be evaluated together for ATC in order to facilitate that competition process for limited ATC. If there is, if there's more ATC than there is requests, then everybody gets the ATC. Everybody that's requested that ATC on the intertie, there's no issue. Everybody gets the ATC. Where on the next slide, if we can go there, where the competition process comes into play is that there are more requests for ATC than there is available ATC. In that case, I think similar to the OAT process, we would look to run a competition process where effectively the request that has the longest number of hours in duration that's requesting that based on the underlying supply contract, that request would get the access to that available transfer capability, that ATC. So, for example, there in the middle of the page, just to illustrate these concepts, but again, competition being based on the total number of hours requested and the underlying number of hours supported by that supply contract, so that if you have a 2-month 6x16 request, the request is for June and July of ATC across NOB. If they have an underlying supply contract that they're seeking to support, that's a 6x16 duration, it would outcompete a request that just has seeking a capacity ATC on that similar intertie, but it's only just for 1 month in duration. And then similarly, if you have a 1-month 6x16 request that's seeking ATC on a particular intertie, but then you have also a request that's supported by a 6x4 underlying supply contract, but it's for 2 months. That 1-month 6x16 request will get the ATC, at least for that 1 month that they're seeking, because they ultimately have a longer duration of hours when you play out the 6x16 compare 2 months of 6x4. And then I think the important key element here of coming out of these windows is that once you receive ATC coming out of this 2-week window or the day window that we were talking about on the prior slide, once the ATC is granted, then that wheeling through request or that entity that's received that ATC, they have certainty that that ATC is with them. They're not subject to later competition or the risk of being outcompeted. I think when I compare this to the OAT framework, under the OAT framework, you may get the ATC in the monthly horizon, but then you're conditional, what's termed, I think, conditional under the OAT, all the way up until the month before you take service or the start date of service, which means that you can be at risk of being, competed or lose out the ATC. Here, what we're saying is once you come out of that window and you receive that ATC, if you reserve the ATC for next August and September, you come out of this window today, you know that you have that ATC reserved and you're not at risk of losing it for next August and next September. And again, that I think that's trying to be responsive to the request that we've heard that there needs to be certainty when you access this ATC. Entities are securing supply contracts in advance of the summer, and they need certainty as to the level of priority that they have across the ISO system, and this seeks to provide that. Let me see if we can go to the next slide just to see what's on there. Okay, and let me just touch on this, and I think that's the last slide in this area, and then I think we can open it up for questions. But we do want to recognize that there's what we're proposing as well as an ability to resell the wheeling through scheduling priority. Entities that hold those, that wheeling through scheduling priority during the term that they have established that priority. So if they've established that priority for 2 months on a 6x16 basis, they have the ability to resell that priority to the extent that conditions have changed, such that they don't need that any longer after they've taken it already. And there will be a requirement that they report those resales, similar to some of the OAT requirements in the effort to provide transparency, that those resales be reported to the ISO as to the amount of resale, the associated term and duration of the resale, along with the price, and this will be posted publicly, providing visibility and transparency to the process. The one nuance is that, and this was based on some additional discussions and considerations, but if the entity establishes wheeling through priority, but the contract supporting that priority either terminates or they no longer meet the contractual requirements prior to the start date of that ATC that they've reserved, that they would notify the ISO, and the ISO then will release that ATC back to the entities that back for the ability for other entities to reserve it. So this is the one exception here, that if prior to that start date of that ATC, so if they've reserved it for June, but now they no longer meet the necessary contractual requirements because either the contract fell through or something changed, the resources an outage, whatnot, then there's the need to notify the ISO, and that ATC would be made available again to other entities to reserve that have a need for that capacity. But if now you're in the middle of, you've taken that ATC and you're in the middle of the, your term of when you reserve the ATC and conditions have changed, you don't have a need for it on a particular day, time frame, then there's the ability to resell that that ATC. So let me pause here and let me just ask Anthony from the ISO, did I miss anything here? Is there anything you want to clarify or add to that I noted regarding both the requirements as well as this resale component?
No, Milos, I think you did a good job, but I'd be interested in leaving more time to answer questions from folks about this.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. Okay, I think we can pause then. Pause for questions here.
Okay, we have one question in the queue. Let's go to Seth. Can we unmute Seth Cochran's line?
Sorry, my question is about transparency. Is the CAISO going to show the ATC request, maybe not the requester's name, but just the source sync or the quantity and all of those things? I think today that's available when you for wheeling transactions just throughout the WEC. I think when you go out on Oasis and you procure transmission or request transmission, those are able to be seen. Is the CAISO proposing anything like that in the realm of transparency?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, the intent is to, throughout this process and as we craft this reservation process, is to provide a similar level of transparency as is provided today under the OAT when requests are submitted for ATC. So yeah, we would mask certain information, but we would certainly identify, I think, the amount of ATC being requested and different points. We would also make available very transparent how much ATC is available at different interties, and then as requests are submitted, that would be visible as well. Again, we would probably mask certain requirements, certain information to not attribute it to certain parties, but in terms of, there's a request for 20 megawatts from point A to point B. There's another request, for this duration for point A to point C. Certainly providing that level of transparency, similar to what I think is provided under the OATs, on their OAS, on the other transmission providers' OASIS websites.
Hey, Milos, I think in a simultaneous request window type process, there may be some sort of requirements that, we'll call them bids, have to be blind. I think we're going to need to take a look at that, but I think there may be some additional requirements under the type of process that we are proposing.
Yeah, but certainly, ultimately, coming out of that process, there will be visibility as to, how much APC has been reserved and what remains available as well. But fair question. I think in the next iteration of the proposal, we can, in the context, as Anthony notes, in the context of the windows, we can explain more clearly or add some to the paper that talks about what would we show, what would be available within the windows as compared to after the windows and after the ATC is granted. The intent is to provide as much transparency as possible while protecting, obviously, commercial interests. Okay.
There's one other question in the queue.
Hey, Milos, Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Just real quick question on the resale. Would the purchasing entity once again have to demonstrate it has a contract?
That's a great question. I don't know, Anthony, that I didn't necessarily think about. I mean, I would.
Because I think generally on resales under, and obviously those with more expertise on the existing nodes, but I think the resales are, just that. They're not subject to any kind of limitations on demonstration of contractual requirements, but this is somewhat of a different case, it appears.
Yeah, fair question. I mean, Anthony, what are your thoughts? I mean, I don't know that you and I talked necessarily about this, but it seems like a reasonable requirement since it's an important component of who holds these resale rights, that it's the entity that ultimately is going to be using them, the reselling, that the entity that's obtaining the resold ATC also has a contractual requirement such that they're going to utilize that scheduling priority.
Milos, it's not part of our proposal at this time. I guess I'd like to hear stakeholder comments and get their views on this issue because, I could see arguments on both sides of the equation for including it as a requirement or not including it as a requirement. So I would encourage folks in their written comments to address this specific issue so we can evaluate them and make some sort of call on this.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great suggestion. Okay. All right. Let's see where we are then. Here. Okay. So I think now we're getting to the post-task process, but let me maybe let's come back to this section next. I do want to make sure that while we have the planners with us, that we can touch on the planning aspect, and then we'll come back to this section right after. And that gives me time also to make sure I can get Guillermo to join us back for this portion of the discussion. So let's skip a couple of slides and then we'll come back to this right after the study and expansion process for establishing that wheeling through scheduling priority on a longer-term basis to the extent that there was a stakeholder that wanted to do that, and what's the process for being studied and potentially pursuing upgrades. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll turn it over to Robert to walk us through these slides. And then Robert, on the last slide of this, if you feel comfortable turning it over to me or you covering it, that works as well. This is when we talk about the financial aspects. But I'll turn it over to you, Robert.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Milos. So on this first slide, as I think we've gone over in earlier presentations, the ISO is looking at how we would accommodate long-term requests for wheeling through the ISO and into the ISO. And as the slide is talking about, it provide certainty on a longer-term basis for those transmission needs, I suppose, for external entities. The process we're looking at is focused on the deliverability study portion of our generation interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures processes, and so it's really focused on just the deliverability portion of that, not the generation interconnection. And as I'll get in more detail in later slides, why we need to do that and how. It is an annual cluster study process, and I'll touch on that as well in the later slides. Can we go to the next slide? The additional power flows across the ISO transmission system caused by wheeling transactions can impact the deliverability of ISO generation. So therefore, we need to study long-term wheeling and generation deliverability requests together. Long-term requests are those with a duration of 1 year or longer and includes both wheeling through and wheeling in transactions. The requests will be clustered together and studied annually, both the wheeling requests and the generation deliverability requests will be studied, clustered together and studied annually. And then we'll also need an additional assessment to look at Path 26 during resource shortage conditions to determine if some of those wheeling constraints might cause constraints on Path 26, again, during resource shortage conditions. Next slide. The initial study results will determine if a transmission upgrade is needed or whether the ISO can accommodate the request without an upgrade. These results will be provided within 90 to 120 days for the request within the first year of the planning horizon and within 180 days for requests for years 2 through 10. If transmission constraints are identified in the initial results, then the request cannot be accommodated without further analysis. Next slide, please. The study process consists of a phase 1 study, a phase 2 study, and a deliverability allocation process. The phase 1 study will identify whether any transmission system upgrades are needed to accommodate requests within years 3 through 10. And requests within the first 2 years of the long-term horizon will be studied in the operational deliverability assessment in the phase 2 study of the preceding cluster study cycle. And if an upgrade is needed, the phase 1 study will provide the estimated costs of the necessary upgrades. The customer will be required to submit a financial posting consistent with the GetOut process in order to proceed to the phase 2 study. In addition, the customer will be required to select whether they would like to proceed with under option A or option B. If they select option B, then they will compete with other requests to receive deliverability across major constraints in the deliverability allocation process. If they select option B, then the transmission upgrades and their costs needed to accommodate the request will be identified in the phase 2 study. And Milos, I'm happy to turn over the next slide to you if you'd like to cover it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll cover this slide, and then I think we can pause for questions if we want to go into a bit further on any of those options or other questions about the process. But I think an important question that we noted and we wanted some stakeholder feedback on in the paper was regarding transmission credit. What do ultimately entities that pursue transmission upgrades across the ISO system, if they're funding those upgrades, what are they getting in return, or what's that funding mechanism with how are they getting some of those funded amounts back? And so, I think as Robert noted, that similar, I think, to what the OAT frameworks require and other transmission providers around the country, that if an entity is going to fund is going to pursue a transmission upgrade, they're largely upfront funding that upgrade and providing that security upfront to support the construction of the upgrade. But after the completion of that upgrade, I think the question is, what do they receive? Does that transmission wheeling through transmission customer that established the wheeling through scheduling priority, are they receiving transmission credits as they take service, which I think is a common concept under the OAT, which the concept of credits is as they're taking, when that upgrade becomes energized, and as they're taking that transmission service, or in this instance, as they're receiving that wheeling through scheduling priority, that they are not charged for service, but they're effectively receiving credits that offset the amount that's funded until they're paid back fully for that funded amount that supported the upgrade. That's called transmission credits. And under the OAT, I think there's a period of a lump sum being provided after a certain period of time, which may vary across providers, but we would look to identify that process. Or alternatively, is there an opportunity here, for the parties to bilaterally agree with the participating transmission owner that may ultimately be funding that may be ultimately doing the construction of these upgrades? Could they fund that upgrade and then mutually agree between the two parties, the PTO and the wheeling through transmission customer, as to the payment of those transmission charges over a specified period of time until the cost of the upgrade are paid off? Or alternatively, is there a mechanism here, is there a preference here as well, that the wheeling through customer, if they're funding that upgrade up front, that they are receiving an allocation of congestion revenue rights associated with that facility for the life of the facility, effectively. So these are some of the questions I think we've posed. The GitOp process, the generator interconnection and deliverability assessment process, which Robert mentioned, we're leveraging certain aspects of that. It does provide today for a default of effectively a 5-year repayment of funded amounts, but that's more in the context of generators that are driving upgrades across the system as a result of their deliverability needs. This may be, we don't think necessarily that 5-year repayment process lends itself well and may lend itself a bit more to gaming. And that's why we're seeking some feedback on whether it makes sense to do a transmission credits over a period of time as they take service, such that, and as they establish that priority, or some more of a bilateral arrangements between the PTO and the wheeling through customer, or is there an interest here also, or optionality at least, in the context of receiving congestion revenue rights in return for funding that upgrade? So certainly appreciate any feedback from stakeholders today or in their comments on any aspects of design. But let me pause here for questions, and then we'll move on to the post-HAS process. But any questions for Robert as to the clarification, any questions or clarifications as to the different options that he mentioned? We elaborate a little bit of that in the paper and cite to the GitOp process that provides different options. But any questions or clarifications regarding the study and expansion that we can provide, whether now or offline, by all means, feel free to reach out.
We have one question in the queue. Let's unmute Tyrone.
Hey, Robert, this is Tyrone from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hey, thanks. Hey, appreciate the clarifying content you've offered here. One of the questions that I had as you were describing how this would work with the Git app is, where does the MIC expansion request fit in with this as well? So I'm assuming, because that's also using the same process, or maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. So does the MIC expansion request also being studied along with the wheel through request? Is that your all's vision?
Well, the MIC expansion requests first go through the transmission planning process to make sure that the MIC can actually be expanded. And then once that determination is made, we then make that an assumption in the generation interconnection process.
So you're saying when you say, but I thought they were also planning to, in the MIC expansion, they were looking to expand MIC, but also willing to pay for it in the similar way that you are envisioning for wheeling. Is that not the case?
Yeah, so we are including wheeling in requests, priority scheduling wheeling in requests. I don't think we've thoroughly vetted whether those wheeling in requests would, certainly they would get scheduling priority, as Milos has been discussing for the last 2 hours. But I don't think we've covered whether they would get MIC, I suppose, deliverability. I think I'm assuming that, but we haven't crossed that bridge yet in the discussion, I'll admit. Unless Catalin wants to jump in or Milos, but that seems like a reasonable extension to me, at least.
Yeah, because I guess I might have misunderstood. I thought they were definitely related in the ways in which it had been presented, because MIC is dealing with deliverability, and what I heard you describe is you're using the Git app process, the deliverability, cases. So I'm assuming that I'm making that connection based upon that assumption.
Well, the primary objective is to provide this scheduling priority, wheeling scheduling priority for the wheel throughs. The wheel ins are sort of bolted on afterwards. And I think, and Catalin could speak to that, but I think that was touched on a process that he was working on a while back. And I think that's how it got carried over into this process. But again, the major objective is to just provide the scheduling priority, but for the wheel ins, possibly in addition to the scheduling priority, possibly they could get a MIC as well. But again, that's I think that's part of this. Do they get CRRs? Do they get transmission, or do they get cash back? It's part of the compensation, I think, discussions, and so I guess I think we're just looking for comments on that.
Okay, well, I guess the part that will be helpful then for me then, as you're describing, because I agree with you. When you start talking about transmission credits or CRRs and stuff like that, it gets a little murky. What I'm trying to really get to is the assumptions that are being made in the studies that you're doing. So when you have a MIC expansion request that's taken into account a set of generation that's looking to import across a particular path, let's say Malin, and then you have this wheeling service request that's saying we have contracted resources of 100 megawatts across the same path. What then are the assumptions in the studies, the engineering power flow studies that are being conducted to evaluate the transmission needs? And so that's the part that I'm trying to make sure that I understand clearly.
Let me touch on that one, Catalin, first. But yes, in terms of the technical studies, the assumptions will look like Mick. But I'm sorry, I was calling him Catalin and I'm talking over him. But go ahead, Catalin.
No, it's okay. The MIC expansion requests are modeled in the operational deliverability studies for year 1 first, then they're modeled in the TPP deliverability study, and they're also modeled in the GIP studies as well. So yes, once we receive these wheeling requests, they will all be studied in together if necessary. Again, there's a few steps you need to do to make expansion requests in order to get there. And today, the make expansion requests are not allowed to pay for transmission. This is what it was part of our last stakeholder meeting. And what we promised people is that if we are allowing the wheel-throughs to pay for transmission upgrades, that we will start allowing internal requests to pay for additional transmission. So I guess this is where the wheel-ins are coming in here. So we will coordinate these two, the make expansion request and the wheel-throughs, to see if anybody wants to pay for transmission upgrades. So that would be a separate thing than what we have today on the make expansion request. Today, the make expansion requests do not trigger transmission on their own. They're just expanding MIG for everybody, and everybody pays for it.
Okay, that makes sense. So there will be a coordination between the two. That's helpful. And then maybe if you could expound, because I think I heard, and maybe I might have misheard earlier, but as I think there was a distinction that was being drawn between MIC and the wheeling services, and the example or the note that was used is that MIC is simultaneous and wheeling is non-simultaneous. Can you expound further on that? Because my understanding is that the GET app and the GET cases that you all are using, those are based on simultaneous path constraints and not necessarily non-simultaneous. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, thank you, Tyrone. I don't want to expand on that at this point in time. The idea is that the ATC calculations are not the same as MIG, and at this point in time, they're not tied together other than the long-term request where we need to protect deliverability for the internal resources and MIG, then they get put together in those studies. But other than that, there is no, shorter term study that deals with the same deliverability issues as these studies we're talking about here. So what I'm trying to draw the attention is that please do not mingle these two. They're not really the same. Yet in the long term, we would be studying them because we made a commitment to internal generators and our mix. So we'll be studying them together because we have a process for them. It is a different process for the month ahead, and that does not relate back to the value of mix. Thanks.
Okay, that's helpful, Catalin, and I know we've had conversations about this, and I think I'll just reiterate again, which is if the goal of the process is to protect reliability, part of the process, I should say, is ensuring that reliability is protected for native load, and the way in which the ISO is doing that is via the deliverability studies. I would raise a concern that if you are saying that's how you're doing in deliverability studies, but then not doing that in the near term, that would highlight a gap that should be closed. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you, Robert and Catalin. Okay, I don't think I see any more questions. And again, by any means, if stakeholders have additional questions, by all means, feel free to put them into the chat. We'll respond to them afterwards, or send us an email offline as well. Let's go to the next slide and let's talk about let's go back to the topic that we skipped, the post-hash process. To a couple of topics back. There we go. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I think we've touched on this, but we have also Guillermo with us, and let me tee this up, and then I think we can turn it over to just illustrate again, because I think it's important here, and we can do a better job in the next iteration of the paper to illustrate under what circumstances in particular, maybe illustrated more specifically, different scenarios under which these become relevant, these priorities. But I think the key aspect of these scheduling priorities is that, most of the time they're not relevant. The system has sufficient capability to be able to accommodate different requests, different awards in the market, but to the extent that there are constraints, and Guillermo is going to cover under what circumstances, I think it includes D rates and potential supply shortages. But to the extent that there are constraints that affect the individual interties and that there may be a market infeasibility and we cannot accommodate all of the awards or all of the self-schedules and economic awards across that particular intertie, then those scheduling priorities become relevant. In that HAS process, the market is going to adjust economic schedules and potentially adjust low priority self-scheduled transactions in order to receive the amount of necessary relief to address the infeasibility. To the extent that that infeasibility persists and there's additional steps that need to be taken such that there's really now a very limited amount of transmission capacity that can support a limited amount of transactions across that particular intertie, this is where that post-HAS process comes into play, where those then scheduling priorities associated with high priority wheeling transactions in relation to ISO load transactions are adjusted on a pro rata basis. This is effectively where we look to apply that pro rata assessment between the wheel-throughs that have that high scheduling priority across that particular intertie that have been scheduled, and we compare it to and adjust it compared to the imports that are coming across that intertie that are self-scheduled that are meeting intended to meet ISO load. And so if we go into the next slide. So in the current post-HAS process, this is what's currently under this interim framework, that those high priority wheel-throughs are compared to the resource adequacy, real-time energy bids, or the shown RA capacity of those bidded RA imports at a particular intertie. That's the comparison that's made to derive that pro rata assessment and the adjustment needed between those transactions to still allow some of those to allocate that limited amount of transmission space that may be available due to an infeasibility on a particular intertie. Under the proposal, since we're looking to now calculate, as FERC has dictated us to do, is calculate your native load needs in order to derive what you need for native load and what's available for others. Under the proposal, what we would now look to do is derive that pro rata assessment by comparing the high priority wheel-throughs that have reserved that ATC in advance and compare that to the volume of scheduled RA and non-RA contracted imports that have been identified in advance. And that's now the pro rata assessment. If you have limited transmission across that intertie that you need to now allocate between those transactions, you will do that pro rata assessment when you're adjusting those schedules between the high priority wheels and the import transactions. I think an element that we put forward in the proposal was the consideration of, should also capacity procurement mechanism imports, to the extent that there are imports. We do capacity procurement mechanism awards, internal supply, but also potentially of imports in certain instances. To the extent that we do a CPM for an import, should also be reflected in this ratio of comparison of high priority wheels to ISO load and contracted RA imports transactions. These CPM are ultimately contracted supply, may be done a little bit closer in time, not necessarily 2 months in advance or a month in advance, but sometimes it is. And if it is, then it represents contracted supply. But if it's not, if it's done a bit closer in time, should that also be included in that ratio of determining what is that ISO load component that consists of contracted RA and non-RA imports? So let me pause here. I know we've had a number of questions on this, and I want to dedicate, the majority of the time that we have left on this. But let me just turn it over to Guillermo, see if Guillermo, again, you can help us in the stakeholder community just understand under what circumstances, just illustrate both from a D-rate perspective of transmission facility as well as a non-D-rate perspective, when these priorities are then effectuated in this post-HAS process. When is this post-HAS process triggered, depending on the conditions that we're seeing on the grid?
Sure, Milos, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, let me start by trying to frame this slightly different from the basics. because I think we currently have a process for allocating limited capacity, and we're going to have somehow still a process to allocate that limited capacity. I think the main difference is going to be what the reference is going to be for the native load. But the mechanics of how that pro rata allocation is going to be largely the same. It's just the reference, what megawatt value we're going to take for native load currently versus in the proposal. All the mechanics of the scheduling priorities largely remain in place. And because of that, I think it's useful to try to put the reference of what we currently have. Now, there are different scenarios we can elaborate to highlight the salient features of the current logic. And let me start from the very basic. So if we focus, this is really related to intertie transmission constraints, intertie scheduling limits. And for this scheduling limit, we are going to impose a constraint. One of the principles is that if we impose that constraint to ensure that we don't violate that scheduling limit. So different things will happen in order to ensure that we still comply with the limit. This is not just a market construct. This is an operational construct. If for whatever reason the market is not able to enforce the scheduling limit on the intertie, eventually operators will have to curtail transactions to ensure that that limitation is still enforced. So it's not just operation market idea, it's also an operational implication. That limit has to be respected. Now, if we start from that basic point, on a given intertie, we are going to have at any point in time different combinations of transactions. We may have exports going out of the system through that intertie that may provide counterflow to the import. We may have imports coming in different. One of them could be economical imports. They are just willing to transact power on that intertie at a given price. Then we may have low priority transactions. And these transactions are going to be treated with some scaling priority, higher than economical bid. And then we're going to have another type of transactions that are the high priority transactions, including the will-through transactions that can have a high priority. So when the intertie capacity is limited and is not able to accommodate all the available imports willing to flow through that intertie, the market is going to go through the normal sequencing of priorities. If it is too much import coming into the transaction, through the intertie, first we're going to, on economically not clear all the economic imports. They are the first ones to not be awarded. If that is not enough, we're going to start reducing the self-schedules from the low priority transactions. If that is still not enough, we may come to the high priority. Now, when it comes to the treatment of will-through transactions, I was indicating, a will-through transaction is constructed with two sides of the transaction. One is an import, one is an export. It does matter what type of transaction we are dealing with because they can also be lower or higher priority. But regardless, when we define what the priority for the will-through is, that is not based only on the import transaction coming through the given intertie. It's also defined with the priority associated with the export that is going on the other side of the equation. So effectively, the will-through transaction is defined with the relative price difference of these two scheduling priorities of the imports and the exports. So if we have to go into a mode that we don't have enough transmission capacity on the intertie and we have to reduce the schedules, what is going to be the sequencing to reduce the imports to the point where it's feasible? Economical bids, low priorities, high priority, and eventually, in the last round, the will-through transactions. When we are going to differentiate the need to reduce a wheel-through transaction versus an import transaction that is going to be supporting CAISO load, they are going to be effectively with the same priority only and only in the scenario where we are unable to meet our demand that we call the power balancing feasibility. So if we have any scenario, let's say where we have a derate on the intertie and we don't have enough intertie capacity to flow all the transactions, including the wheels, there will be the same treatment for wheel-through transactions and the import serving the CAISO load, as long as we are not able to meet our demand. The very same scenario may happen, and if we still have enough supply from somewhere else, from other interties, from internal supplies, as long as we are not unable to meet our demand, the priorities on that intertie is going to be such that the wheel-through transactions are going to have actually a higher priority than the imports serving the CAISO demand. The only condition in which the CAISO demand and the imports serving the CAISO demand have the same priority as the wheel-through transactions is only under the scenario where the CAISO demand cannot be met, because now we have the power balancing feasibility that has the same penalty price associated to the export transaction of the wheel. So now we are talking under the very same basis. But it has to be specifically under that particular condition that, one, we cannot flow all the intertie imports coming into the intertie. At the same time, we have this infeasibility to meet our own demand. If we don't have the condition that we are not able to meet our demand, then even if we have a derated capacity on the intertie, the wheel-through transactions still have higher priority than the import serving the CAISO load. I know it's a little bit complicated because it's all relative to the scaling priorities and the numbers matter. Let me pause and see if this makes sense or we need to tackle this in a different angle.
Thank you, Guillermo. And this is where Lindsay and Steve and I can't remember who else maybe it was. It was Doug and others. By all means, see if this helps. I mean, this is fairly narrow, as we've been alluding to all along. Fairly narrow application of when these priorities really come into play, which gives us kind of a higher level of confidence. As was the case with the summer heat wave in September, we didn't cut any or adjust wheeling through transactions. I don't think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think low or high priority. So these are fairly narrow instances but it provides a higher level of certainty on when these scheduling priorities apply for these transactions. And even low priority, I think wheel-throughs still have a high degree of reliability. But let's pause for questions. I see Lindsay.
Let's unmute Lindsay.
You may be double muted. Okay.
Hi, Milos. It's Lindsay Schluckaway with NV Energy. I appreciate going into more detail on this. I still think this is something that we need to discuss with stakeholders, because I'm concerned that if we cannot rely on our wheel-throughs during those circumstances in which, there's heat waves, then we're spreading, I almost feel like we're spreading the reliability onto others. And I think it depends on the situation. If the shortage is caused by a load serving entity not having enough capacity to meet their load, then that's a different situation than a transmission derate. And I think this is something we really need to understand, what product we're really getting with this. Because if I can't rely on my wheel-through in those extreme conditions, then that's a problem. So
yeah, no, I recognize that, Lindsay. But let me just ask. I mean, Guillermo just explained when I didn't get out of his explanation that there's if you establish the high scheduling priority, that there's a scenario there where you can't necessarily rely on your wheel through. What we're saying is you're going to have equal priority to load transactions in those instances. Maybe you can help me clarify, out of what Guillermo explained, what gave you pause in terms of thinking that you can't rely on wheel throughs, especially if you have established high scheduling priority? Because I think what Guillermo said is that in all of those instances, if you have the high scheduling priority for a wheel through, and even a low priority, I think, as we've seen with a more recent heat wave, with a high priority wheel through, it's going to be very rare instance where those priorities are going to be triggered. And if they are triggered in that instance, we're affording you equal priority to ISO import load transactions. So I just want to better understand it.
Yes. Okay. So in those, we're basically talking about when heat waves occur. So in that situation, if there's a power balance in feasibility, from what I'm understanding, and maybe I'm misunderstanding what Guillermo is saying, from what I understand, if there's a power balance in feasibility, then we would be curtailed along with we would be curtailed in that situation with load. It would not be that our wheel through would still flow. Is that correct? I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding that.
No, you're right, Lindsay, but let me be more surgical on the characterization. It has to be a condition in which you have two factors playing at the same time. One is that we are short of supply, and because of that, we are projecting that we cannot meet our own demand through the market. Concurrent with having limited intertie capacity, such that we cannot accommodate all the import leg of the wheels plus all the imports serving the CAISO load. And that scenario basically means that we may have a condition in which we are short of supply, and in addition to that, we have a delay on the intertie, such that we cannot accommodate all the transactions. And if that is specifically the condition, then yes, not only the wheel-through transactions are going to be reduced, but also the import serving CAISO loads are going to be reduced. And that is what I was referring to, the same treatment, because now they are at the same place, at the same priority, and they are going to be proportionally reduced based on the logic that Miller described. So under that condition, it's not that the wheel-through transactions are being kicked out and displaced by the CAISO transactions. We ourselves will not be able to meet our demand with all the expected imports that we could have. So our imports are going to be reduced in the same proportion as the wheel-through transactions.
Okay, and I guess are you stating in this example that there is a transmission derate too? Like there's an intertie constraint, and I'm not following that piece.
What I'm saying is that the most likely scenario for this to happen is that the intertie has to be limited in capacity. And most likely it's going to happen when you have a derate, right, such that you don't have the nominal intertie capacity, such that you cannot accommodate all the imports that historically would be able to flow through.
Okay.
Yeah, so Lindsay, if hopefully that helps, but, the idea behind these scheduling priorities is that in those very corner case scenarios, under the various conditions that may trigger those infeasibilities, and primarily as Guillermo has noted, in those narrow cases where you've got loss of import capability at a particular intertie plus other conditions going on the grid, where these priorities come into play. And even when the priorities come into play, you're first making adjustments to other transactions prior to even getting to the high priority transactions. And so you can potentially resolve those constraints of those issues with adjustments to economic imports, adjustments to economic transactions, adjustments to low priority transactions. And only then do you afford an equal priority. We may adjust the wheel through on a pro rata basis and on par with an import that's intended to serve load under those instances. I don't know if you're I think that's been the framework here over the last couple of years. That equal priority, which I think is fairly unique in this instance, that that's a fairly high priority that's afforded to both ISO load transactions and wheel throughs. But I don't know if you're suggesting that there be, absolute certainty, which I don't know that we can do, and wheel throughs have higher priority than load. I think that we've settled on this equal priority here in the last round. But yeah, we can certainly follow up with you offline and walk more through this. But we think that this application is fairly narrow, and then the value of that, what you're getting if you establish this scheduling priority, is that if you do find yourself in those corner case scenarios, then you have a higher level of certainty than if you had a lower priority wheel through transaction. You have a high priority that we would only curtail it or adjust it in those limited instances, as Guillermo explained, and it will be on a pro rata with load, not before load transactions. So we'll follow up with you, Lindsay, offline and see if there's other questions as well. Let's see, Steve, and then maybe we can move on to just the last topic here, just last couple of slides. But Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Milos and Guillermo. That was Steve Green with Brookfield. That was helpful because, and I keep kind of going into do loop because I think I understand Lindsay's question. I think the premise is if a BA like the CAISO fails a resource efficiency, that's their issue, and high priority wheels should flow. And I think what I heard Guillermo says is that in those circumstances, absent a transmission constraint on that specific intertie, the wheel through priority would in fact have the highest priority. And it's only in the circumstance where that power balance constraint is combined with a transmission constraint on the intertie that it would have equal priority. So in no circumstances is load higher than a high priority wheel. They can have equal priority, or in fact, a high priority wheel could have actually higher priority, absent a power balance constraint and intertie constraint. I think that's what I heard. And I think that makes sense, but it would be helpful to have that clearly written out in the proposal. One question I have, just, and once again, apologies if you explain this, but in the middle bullet, do you have a sense as to the volume on non-RA contracted imports? And I'm trying to just get a better appreciation of what constitutes a non-RA contracted import.
Yeah, good question. I think we have a general sense based on some information that we've gathered from different entities as to the volumes, but it's sizably smaller than, as you can imagine, than the RA imports than the resource adequacy imports that parties may have shown. And so, I think we've heard from certain entities that these are fairly distributed across different interties, and so they may be able to contract for them in advance. But we would say, I mean, based on some of the data that we've seen, I don't have a gross amount across the entire footprint, but across some of the more, for lack of a better term, popular intertie points, it ranges anywhere from 50 to 150 to 200 megawatts, at least in some of the more peak months. Obviously, this would be part of the new process where entities would, in order for us to protect for those, the entities would be submitting some of this data on a historical basis, but also on a forward basis, what they've contracted for. But we certainly anticipate that those are smaller than what's been shown on RA plans. And so some of the reasons that we've heard entities may have some of these non-RA contracted imports that didn't necessarily make it onto plans is that some of the entities may have different LRA requirements that add an additional buffer in certain instances. They may not necessarily have secured the MIC in advance, but nevertheless, in order to meet their obligations under that local regulatory authority, they're procuring additional imports that are delivered to serve loads. There may be different reasons. Some of them, may be more economic than others, but they do exist, and entities have procured those under different conditions and didn't show it on RA plans.
Okay. I mean, to the extent it's possible, it'd be nice to get a better sense on. Yeah, I'm just not following why anybody would do bilateral economic displacement, effectively transactions outside the CAISO market. But anyway, I just may not be getting it. But if you could provide a little more detail on what potential size of that bucket, and just because it can have a material impact on the calculation. So and what kind of transactions are included in that? I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Lindsay, again. And we'll certainly elaborate in the next iteration more on this topic, and we'll also follow up with you, Lindsay, as well to maybe walk through some more scenarios. And if others are interested as well, and this is causing a bit of consternation or lack of a clear picture on when can this high priority really trigger, let us know, reach out, and we'd be certainly happy to work together with you. But otherwise, we'll put a more descriptive section on some examples of when this may trigger in the paper. But I think it is important to note that during the most recent heat wave in particular, and since we've implemented these priorities back in August of 2021, we have not had to trigger these priorities for wheel-throughs, whether low priority or high priority. I don't believe we've cut either of these. At least high priority we certainly didn't cut, and we didn't cut them in this most recent heat wave, which I think provides a bit of insight into the narrowness of when these would trigger and the frequency with which these would trigger based on, again, the vast ability of the market to redispatch and manage conditions on the grid differently. But certainly we'll follow up with you, Lindsay, and others as well. Okay, let's, in the last couple of minutes, let's just touch on the last topics. And if there are any questions that we didn't get to, please note them in the chat or reach to us offline. Just touching on the compensation, and then we'll go to next steps. But compensation for wheeling through scheduling priority, if we can go to the next slide. So this is related to ultimately when somebody establishes that high wheeling through scheduling priority, what is the appropriate transmission charge for that wheeling through priority, recognizing that they're receiving a higher level of certainty and they're accessing limited ATC and ultimately have that high scheduling priority. But I think it's important to acknowledge that under today's design, when an entity establishes that wheeling through priority, that wheeling access charge is only paid when that transaction is scheduled. And so if somebody establishes wheeling through priority for a full month, they're only paying for this transmission effectively only when they schedule it, which could be a handful of times depending on their needs and how they're scheduling their transactions to serve load. This is essentially the same framework for a low priority wheel through. They also pay only when scheduled. And so we think that the current compensation, and based on some of the stakeholder feedback as well, the framework design doesn't reflect the value that the higher wheel through priority provides. So if we go to the next slide, we continue to propose, as we did under the straw proposal, that the wheeling through access charge be assessed based upon ultimately the underlying supply contract duration supporting that wheel through across the system. So if the entity has a 6x16 contract, for example, that's supporting a wheel through transaction, such that they're establishing priority effectively for that 6x16 supply contract that may need to wheel through the ISO, that they're all then being assessed the wheeling access charge based upon that underlying duration of the supply contract, whether or not they schedule it. So for example, again, if you have that 6x16 scenario, they've reserved that ATC for a month across Malin, and to support a 6x16 supply contract delivery that allows them to wheel through the ISO system. The wheeling access charge will apply on that 6x16 basis, whether or not it's whether or not they've scheduled it on any particular hour. And I think that we think that this recognizes the value of that establishment of that higher scheduling priority across the ISO system and that higher level of certainty that entities may gain as compared to a low priority wheeling through transaction across the ISO system. We are modifying the proposal based on stakeholder comments to not require prepayment of these charges, of the transmission charges, so that if somebody reserves transmission or that ATC for next June, August, and September, June, July, August, and September, they're not necessarily needing to prepay for that now at the moment that they reserve it, but rather as they take that transmission service under the regular settlement timelines, they will be assessed that transmission charge based upon the underlying duration of that supply contract that they reserve ATC to support. They'll be assessed that wheeling access charge, whether or not they're scheduling it on any particular hour. And we think, again, that properly recognizes the value of the higher certainty and the higher scheduling priority that's obtained, and it's not inconsistent with necessarily some of the practices under the OAT where entities reserve service and they pay for it, whether or not they've used it on any one particular hour, but they're receiving the scheduling priority here across that 6x16 horizon, and they're paying for it across that 6x16 horizon. So I think that's the last slide before next steps. So I think we can take a question or two, short questions before moving to next steps. So we can pause here, Isabella.
There's two questions in the queue. So let's go to Chris Devon.
Hi, Milos. This is Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Hey, Chris.
Thanks. Sorry to go back to the last discussion, but I'm just not completely clear on that last post-HASP issue and the way that Steve Greenleaf was commenting on that. And I just want to try to get some clarity before you guys go into the next steps, just so I can report out on this and make sure that I'm 100% on it. As far as maybe the way that Steve from Brookfield actually kind of explained his understanding of what Guillermo said, could you guys confirm that? I know that was a little bit ago. I could reiterate it if you wanted me to.
Yeah, let me check with Guillermo. Guillermo, do you recall how that was framed, or do you want Chris to?
I think Steve got it right, so I agree with the characterization.
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat it one more time, just for my understanding. It's basically that what we're saying here is really if there's a curtailment on the actual transmission intertie that the ATC is reserved on, that's really when this priority starts to be made at the same level as the native load and the PT wheel through. Potential curtailments would be made, as opposed to if there was just like a generation inadequacy event across the entire CAISO BA. And in that case, there might be a chance that the wheel throughs would still have a higher priority and not be curtailed if there was no specific curtailment or derate on the actual intertie that it was reserved on. Is that fair to say in that way?
Not really. Let me try to summarize it. So the curtailment of wheel-through transactions is most likely to happen when you have a derate on an intertie constraint, simply because now you are squeezing the constraint and you may not be able to accommodate all the imports and the wheel-through transactions. It's just that it's going to make it more likely to happen. The wheel-through transactions will be reduced pro rata only when you have two conditions met. The intertie constraint is binding; it has been exhausted. At the same time, you are unable to meet the CAISO demand.
Okay, so in that sense, basically, if we're using all the interties at the full amount, and there's a power balance constraint, meaning the generation inadequacy events occurring, then there would still be a chance that you would be able to curtail these at the same priority level as native load. That's what I'm hearing. Is that fair, Guillermo?
Yes, but it's key that the intertie constraint is completely exhausted, is binding. That has to be a condition to be met.
Okay, and I think I certainly understand and can respect the point about the fact that there would most likely occur when there was some kind of a derate, and if we had studied this appropriately, that there should be probably enough room for these to flow and under most normal, even somewhat scarce conditions. So I think I'm okay with it at this point with my understanding of it, but I'll look forward to that other more examples and written kind of clarification in the future. So I'll leave it at that, but I appreciate the additional discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. All right, and it looks like let's just finish up with Steve here, and then we can move on to next steps. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be very brief. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Just real quickly, Milos, I just wanted to reiterate the point I made earlier, or request, I guess, that you guys clarify in the next iteration how additional imports, the result of load biasing, which I presume are going to be economic imports, factor into the calculation. It seems to me that they don't, that those economic imports, along with lower priority wheels and whatnot, would be curtailed first prior to getting into the allocation methodology. But if you could clarify that, and both Dan, and as well as Dan's question about out-of-market purchases at the enterprise. That's just a request to clarify those 2 points. And then lastly, and once again, apologies if it's detailed in the paper, can you, assuming for a second we have this in place alongside EDAM, are these going to work the same way as bucket 2 transmission, in the sense that if they're not scheduled in the day ahead, the CAISO will utilize, based on my understanding of the current EDAM proposal, the CAISO will utilize that transmission in the market, but then the entity will be able to, I know for bucket 2, the entity will be able to come in and schedule those rights in real time. Is it going to work the same way for these wheel-throughs? I.e., if they're not scheduled in the day ahead, the entity will be able to come in and schedule them in real time. Does that make sense?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. The entity, they're able to continue to exercise their wheeling through scheduling priority across the ISO system, much as they can do today. And I think where this is, we spent a little bit of time in the paper talking about the interplay with EDAMs when you have a chance to take a look. But I think where this becomes particularly more relevant is those wheel-through transactions. Is it with an EDAM BA or a non-EDAM BA? But I think you're generally right that the entity that establishes that wheeling through scheduling priority, they have the ability to come in and exercise those all the way into and establish that scheduling priority all the way into real time.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'll go look at that part of the paper. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And and thank you again, folks. I'll turn it over to Isabella here shortly, but let me just thank everybody for taking the time, and I appreciate you all coming in on a Friday morning on a busy day, and there's a stakeholder meeting after this at 1 p.m. So really appreciate all of you taking the time and all the interest. And let me just reiterate again that we're going to look at the chat questions that we didn't get to today. If other questions come up beforehand, before the comments are due, by all means, feel free to email us. We're happy to get together with you, talk about, exchange emails, or get together on the phone and discuss these items before the comments in particular are due. We may do some of our own proactive outreach. Like I said, Lindsay will be reaching out to her just to make sure her questions are answered. We may reach out to some others as well that based on the questions in the chat. I didn't get to see them all, but if it's more effective to do that in person, we'll do some of our proactive outreach as well. But all means, please feel free to engage with us. This is an important topic, and it will help inform the next iteration of the proposal, and we're looking forward to your input. So with that, again, thank you very much on behalf of the ISO team for taking the time, and I'll turn it over to Isabella to talk about some of the next steps.
Thanks, Milos, and I'd just like to echo Milos's appreciation. Thank you all for joining us on a Friday morning. We really appreciate your participation today. So as far as the initiative schedule goes, we will be taking comments after the holidays on January 4th, so that is our deadline. And then we're also looking to post the final proposal in early January on the 11th. And then between now and March 2023, we'll be working on developing the initial draft tariff language and business requirement specifications for this initiative. And then we will take this initiative to the Board of Governors and WEIM governing body meeting for joint approval in February of 2023 for joint decision. So then as far as next steps go, the draft final proposal and this presentation are posted to the initiative webpage. The link to that initiative webpage are available here on this slide. And again, stakeholder comments are due after the holidays on January 4th. And you can submit comments using the template that is available on the initiative webpage. We did publish that yesterday, so it is available and ready for you to use at any time. But thank you all for joining us today. That concludes today's meeting, and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.